Ladies and gentlemen, today is June the 26th, 2022, and we are about to begin another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith, where we talk about the world, current events, history, foreign politics, economics, blah blah blah. I will jump into a voice chat and we will speak about things. Hello?
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 Hey, how are you?
Pretty good, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Recovered from last week?
Well, last week I just had a headache, and we had roofers coming at 6 a.m. Monday morning.
Ooh, gross.
So between the two, I figured discretion was the better part of valor.
That is smart. I approve of this choice. But the chat has been freaking out this week, asking about your cat in RimWorld.
Oh, man. He's fine. He's no longer on the sauce.
Okay. Making a break with alcoholism. His virtual cat in RimWorld. That's good to hear.
Yeah, he's doing much better. I think he survived the recent catastrophe, but I'm not sure. I haven't been back to it since. I had to take a break after that.
We did have a rather large news item this week. You can probably guess what it is.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Well, what did you think of that?
Bit, I don't know, it just seemed kind of strange to arbitrarily revisit that. I know we talked about it last week, or not last week, but last time, about the concept of due process and how a bunch of different rulings historically had been made based on that principle. Mm-hmm. So for this ruling, it's kind of bringing into question all of those other things, and many of the other ones were related to social issues and like personal freedoms and stuff. So this would be a turning back of the clock in terms of personal freedoms. One thing that I think is a question mark for some people is, what is the time in development of a fetus when you should no longer have an abortion? And obviously there are a whole bunch of different health reasons and stuff for this, and it's a medical question in addition to being like an existential one for people. But clearly there's a point where the creature that's existing there isn't quite like an individual yet. They don't have a sense of identity. They don't have a lot of what we would consider to be like the rights of a person and that sort of a thing. But I guess one of the starting questions could be, how did this topic come up as something the Supreme Court was going to tackle?
Well, it was a response to legislation that was passed by the state of Mississippi that tried to extend a ban on abortion to 15 weeks. Before, there was a rule that the Supreme Court had implemented after a case in the early 90s called Casey, that basically asserted that anything banning abortion before, I think it was 24 weeks, was considered too much. You know, that would basically be a breach of a person's privacy. Mm-hmm. And various anti-abortion states have pretty frequently passed legislation trying to extend, the ban beyond that. And it was mostly just political theater. It wasn't really a concerted attempt to actually try to get around the legislation. A lot of the laws passed weren't even that creative. Texas passed a creative ban recently, just last year. I think most people remember that. But that was kind of the exception that proves the rule. That was a relatively unusual attempt to actually try and make it a real effort to get around the abortion ban, or get around the Supreme Court's rules on abortion. So one of those not infrequently made their way to the Supreme Court, depending on how they were written. And the Mississippi's most recent attempt made it to the Supreme Court, and that's the one that they ruled on, in which they reversed Roe v. Wade.
And then I think there was that time when there was a leak of Supreme Court communications, and that's when a lot of people started talking about them potentially doing that. Did
Yeah.
did we ever find out why that leak happened?
No, no, there's been no information on that as far as I'm aware. So that's still a mystery. Yeah, that was a draft ruling that was leaked. And it was noted that the actual, case ruling that was released in the past week did not differ that much from the draft leak, even to the point where apparently some of the errors that were in the draft leak were even kept in. So that seems to have been a pretty accurate document as far as how the court was going to rule.
Yeah, and Twitch chat is pointing out this is one of those topics where it's basically impossible to reach a consensus. One thing that I would point out as a foundational reason why people who are pro-life may be pro-life could be there's like a heavy relationship or overlap between people who are pro-life and people who are religious. And I think for religious people, there's a continuous immaterial soul of a person that exists more or less before they were born and persists after they die on earth. And that's kind of the essence that God creates, and then that God decides whether they go to heaven or hell or whatever their afterlife situation is. But I think they perceive it as interrupting that line of continuity would be my guess. People who have their opinions on it, you're free to share why you believe the way that you do. On the flip side, the more secular side, people perceive it as a women's health choice. Like it's something that's happening in their body, and they believe that they should have control over what's happening in their body. Sometimes mistakes happen. They didn't have the right protection, whatever, or something just goes wrong. There's a low percentage chance of that happening. Or people weren't in sound state of mind, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of reasons why a person could get a pregnancy started unintentionally, or they realize that they're not in a good spot to raise a child, which is a very large and expensive project, both in like human resource and just the amount of money required to give the child the support that it needs. So definitely an issue that has been talked about constantly for as long as we've been alive. And it doesn't really seem like we're getting closer to a consensus. It's like the disagreement will always be there. The question is, how are we going to handle this in the legal sense?
Poorly.
Yeah.
Seems poorly. Yeah, this is going to have a balkanizing effect on how abortion is viewed legally within the United States, because obviously about half the states in the union are going to ban it and the other half are not. And that's going to result in it's going to result in a lot of lawsuits, for one, a significant amount of litigation. But it's also going to result in a lot of back and forth between pro and anti-abortion states. Because, of course, if you ban abortion in one state, then you can go to another state and get an abortion. So what is the legality of that? Can you legislate that? Is that even constitutional? And if it is, to what extent do you go in trying to prevent people from leaving the state to get an abortion? To what extent do you prevent people from states that are where abortion is legal to coming to states that where abortion is illegal and advertising the fact that you can come to a state where abortion is legal and get one? To what extent can NGOs help fund people to travel to states where abortion is legal to get abortions? This opens up a massive legal can of worms. There's going to be a tit-for-tat effort on the part of pro and anti-abortion factions in the United States to try to make it more or less available depending on their politics. And it's going to be a mess. It's just going to be a huge just battle between ideologues. And it's going to be very disruptive to the nation's politics as well as just day-to-day life for people who are directly affected by this.
I guess there's also the question of how similar is this to how the federal government and state governments treat cannabis? Because I think it's federally illegal, but certain states have legalized it and the federal government isn't really doing too much about it. They're kind of just letting that happen. So would this be a similar thing?
No, it's not really a similar thing because one of the implicit arguments made by the Supreme Court justices themselves is that the federal government, well, at least the courts themselves can't rule on this. But and in turn, they kind of kicked it to the states. But that's implicitly arguing that it's a state decision more than a federal decision. So if the federal government did pass a national law, I kind of wonder whether or not that would pass constitutional muster given this interpretation. So I'm a little skeptical on that. I don't even know, even with previous justices, if that would have been feasible, just to legalize it or make it illegal at a federal level. It seems like it would invariably end up being a state issue, just because I don't think that you can really interpret the Constitution in a way that says that the federal government can regulate that one way or the other. Maybe you could apply the Commerce Clause, but at that point, it would be regulating interstate commerce, which means that would impact people traveling from one state to the other, or maybe advertising in one state or the other. But it would not inherently prevent people from getting abortions in states where it's legal. So I guess even that could be debatable. And I would point out I'm not a lawyer, as I pointed out many times on here. So I could even be wrong about that. This is just my understanding, given what I know now. But like I said, regardless, it's a huge battle that's going to brew out of this. There's going to be a lot of legislation that is passed by one faction or the other. Those laws are going to conflict with each other, at a national level and at a state level. And there's just going to be a lot of litigation that comes out of that. And anybody's guess, how that turns out. It's a wide open field at this point. But no, I don't think it's the same thing as marijuana because there's no law on the books as of now that says that you, at a federal level, that you can't get an abortion. So it's not like the feds are going to come after you, if you try to get an abortion and we're in a state where it's illegal, or they're not going to come after you if you try to, ban it in a state where it's legal. It's just a state's issue, basically. Yes. Whereas with marijuana, there are federal laws that specifically disallow it. And so there's kind of it's not a constitutional crisis. It's not that bad, but there's a kind of constitutional tension there between the national polity where it's illegal and then the subdivisions where some of them have made it legal.
Mm-hmm. You could say one of the overlap points is that it's an increase in just the power of what the federal government lets the states do.
Well, I wouldn't say
say now.
I wouldn't say the feds are, well, yeah, it's a change in the sense that the feds have kind of, the Supreme Court more accurately has granted that power to regulate abortion back to the states. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, there's some devolution. You're devolving power to subdivisions from the center. So yeah, you would be right in that sense. It's kind of been a long-running debate ever since Roe v. Wade. The interpretation of the Constitution and whether or not you can take the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and apply that to something like abortion or contraceptives or what have you. It was always kind of weird, abstract logic, and the Due Process Clause has always been pretty controversial. There are uncontroversial interpretations of it. There is actual legal due process that it technically is supposed to apply to. And then there's sort of unenumerated rights like privacy, which are generally inferred to be covered by the Constitution, and in some cases by the Due Process Clause. But then you get into weirder stuff. There's like a third abstraction that is taken with the Due Process Clause that was used to extend constitutional protections to abortion. And that was always very controversial. And when I say controversial, I don't mean just controversial politically. I mean, within the legal community, there's always been a lot of debate about that and just how correct that was. And obviously, we have some justices in the Supreme Court now who think differently than previous justices did. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would point out that the ruling is technically sound. Like, they haven't just created an interpretation of the Constitution out of thin air. Like, their interpretation of the Constitution is one that is upheld and believed by many people in the legal community and in the United States. So this isn't coming out of nowhere, per se. That said, there has been a breach of norms here, which is generally what the legal commentary I've read has kind of been more concerned by. There's sort of two implicit norms in the legal system that judges are supposed to observe. And it's not like a written rule or a law anywhere that they have to do this, but it's just kind of understood to be a norm underpinning the common law legal system. One of those norms is that you don't really go against, well, you don't rule in a way that's going to cause massive instability. Even if a given ruling may be correct, it might be correct in a way that aggravates the broader community and causes a lot of unrest, instability, maybe even civil war. So that's actually how we got something like Plessy versus Ferguson, uh, which was the law in the United States that, correct me if I'm wrong on this, chat. It's been a while since since I've studied law, but Plessy versus Ferguson was the legal case which established segregation in the United States. And even at the time that ruling was made, it was the wrong ruling. Like explicitly, it went against the Constitution's intention. But the justices went a different direction because they kind of understood that the country would reject it otherwise. They would not really accept a ruling in which there was not segregation. Technically segregation had been allowed before, but it hadn't. It had kind of been mixed. There was sort of de facto segregation, but not legally enforced. It was a more ambiguous situation. But when states started actually trying to impose it, having the federal courts, tell them that they couldn't would have resulted in significant unrest. That was a period of American history when racism was endemic. Some people would argue it's still endemic, but definitely was endemic in the late 19th century. It was not a society that was going to accept any other ruling, pretty much. So that's one norm in the system. The purpose of the court system is to try to operationalize ethics, morality, and stability. And so you have to kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're ruling on laws. It's not just straight interpretation of the law that you're doing. There is kind of a broader purpose to the legal system. Mm-hmm. And so that's not generally in contradiction with a direct, literal interpretation of the law. But every so often it is. So that's one implicit norm in the legal system. Another implicit norm in the legal system is that you try not to change things too radically. In general, even if a ruling might be the correct ruling, it might create significant disruption just because of its implications. So a better example of this would be John Roberts' ruling in favor of Obamacare. It was Obamacare was very controversial, and one of the cases that was brought against it, by critics, which made its way to the Supreme Court, was a case that argued that the law's provision that you were required to buy health care was illegal. The government can't require you to buy something. That was their argumentation. And the government countered that by, saying that, well, it's actually a tax. It's not a mandate. It's just a tax on people who don't have health care. So you could have ruled that even if you're taxing people who don't have health care, that's kind of an implicit mandate. So it would have made sense if they'd ruled against it. But John Roberts seems to have been of the mind that that would have been very disruptive. It would have been a big change, basically, that would have gone against the public will. So he kind of moderated his opinion. Basically, what they did is they struck down the mandate, but they kept the rest of the law. And that was a big deal because, the critics had been arguing that because they believed that the mandate was unconstitutional, that the whole bill should have been stricken. But the Supreme Court ruled, no, just the mandate is unconstitutional. So the rest of the bill can stand. So that's an example of moderation in court ruling. So those are two implicit norms. Again, they don't really run contradictory to a strict reading of legislation generally, but sometimes they do. So what happened with the recent ruling in Dobbs, which is the case that in which they overthrew Roe v. Wade, they basically just ignored both of those. For one, this is obviously going to be an immensely antagonizing outcome, for half of the country. And like I was mentioning earlier, there's going to be a lot of legal instability that comes out of this. So that's one norm broken right there. But then also, in general, you're not supposed to radically change the status quo too much in the law. And they broke that as well. Obviously, this is a significant break from previous precedent. And John Roberts, again, being more about moderation in his legal philosophy, even wrote in his opinion in the ruling that he believed that While he would have upheld Mississippi's law, he did not think that overruling Roe v. Wade was justified. He would not have done that just for the sake of moderation. And apparently, the justices that were arguing in favor of moderation in the ruling were criticized for doing so. Apparently, for the conservative justices that ruled against Roe v. Wade here, it was more important to rule correctly, according to their legal philosophy. It was always the wrong ruling. That is to say, Roe v. Wade was always an incorrect ruling, legally speaking, and it needed to be overturned. And, technically, again, you can consider that correct, but again, it breaks with those implicit norms in the court. And we're going to see why those norms exist in the coming years. There's probably going to be 10 years of shit that come out of this in US politics and society generally. Mm-hmm. So technically correct, but it's not really correct from a institutional perspective. There has been a breach of institutional norms here. And they've kind of showed that same aggressive approach in some of the other rulings they've made recently. I don't know how much you've been paying attention to some of the other recent rulings. Have you seen some of them?
No. What are some?
Oh boy.
And here we go.
Yeah, well, let me find it in my notes here because I wrote down some of them just so I can be thorough. I think the big one had to do with a gun law in New York City. I think it was New York City, but it might have been New York State. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, there was a law in which, in order to get a concealed handgun license, you had to illustrate that you had a reason to ask for one. And if your reason was not considered good enough, then the state would deny you your license. And that law has been on the books for something like 100 years. I forget the name of the law, but it's been around a long time. And it's survived a number of other attempts to have it, challenged in court. So the Supreme Court actually saw a case regarding that law, and they've basically struck it. Well, they have struck that law down. And they have ruled that there is a constitutional right to have a handgun in public, which goes much further than any previous pro-gun ruling by the Supreme Court, even further than the last one that kind of established that the Second Amendment protects your right to own private firearms. That was a big ruling maybe 10, 15 years ago, whenever it was. This goes even further than that and restricts the ability of states to regulate who can own weapons and where they can wield them, or at least hold them more accurately. So that was a big case also. And I've even seen some people say that was an even more radical ruling than the Dobbs ruling that overthrew Roe v. Wade.
So that's a pro-gun swing then, yeah?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And I think it was a few Agent Smiths ago, maybe even a year ago or something, where we were talking about the Supreme Court being potentially the least partial of the different branches of government. But it seems like this is a pretty just general conservative swing in terms of how things change. Like, yeah, they can give reasons for stuff, but if you're swinging in the same direction for two different things, like that's, I guess.
Well, it's not just two different things.
Oh, here
there's more. So there was a ruling on basically a state program to give funds to public schools. And the program had denied access to those funds to private religious educational institutions. Mm-hmm. So if you had a private religious school, you were not eligible to receive these funds. And the argument in favor, basically, the argument against them being denied the funds was that the locality in question, there was a locality in this state. I forget which state it was. I want to say it was like Vermont or New Hampshire. Basically, this town did not have any public schools because it was too small or they didn't have the money or whatever. What they had was a private school, and it was a private religious school. And so their argument was, if you don't give this money to our private school, then we're just being denied access to public funds for education. And that's not fair. That's discriminatory. And so the Supreme Court actually ruled in their favor. So they have said that if you're going to offer public funds for educational institutions like high schools and whatnot, and even other private schools, which are technically secular, you also have to make those funds available to private religious institutions. Mm. So that's a freedom of religious argument. Sorry, freedom of religion argument. And that's not as radical as the other two cases we've discussed, but that is also a conservative ruling. And some people have criticized that for breaking down some of the walls between church and state, which is, debatable. It kind of always has been. But in this case, this is another example of the court kind of going out and making a strong ruling here. This isn't like moderate ruling like we're kind of used to.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, the fourth one is actually one that I don't think they've technically made yet, or if they did it recently. But basically, they've overturned the requirement to form. Well, are you familiar with Miranda rights?
Those are the ones that the police read you as they're arresting you.
Yeah, yeah.
You have the right to shut the fuck up. Anything you say is going to be a big mistake in court.
Yeah. So basically, they have to read you your rights if they're going to interrogate you or otherwise collect evidence from you. So Miranda rights were meant to prevent people from being tricked into implicating themselves. But the Supreme Court is now saying that, well, has basically watered that down as far as this ruling that they either already made or are going to make. Again, I can't remember quite which it was, but I was reading about the significance of the ruling that they were expected to make. And the expectation is that it's going to be easier, basically. Well, maybe not necessarily easier. Requirements for police to warn you and inform you about your rights before they deal with you when they're in the process of investigating something. Those requirements are going to be much looser now. So the impetus is going to be much more on individual citizens to know their rights rather than having the police or other people working for the government actually kind of help you observe and recognize and utilize your rights.
Weird.
Well, one might argue that the 2020s are something perhaps of a shit show. So not necessarily that surprising in that sense.
You're saying it's par for the course.
Yeah. It's, I don't, maybe you remember, but at the end of 2020, we kind of talked about how, maybe the rest of the decade would be better. 2020 is technically the last year in the 20 teens, so maybe the 2020s will be a sharp departure. Mm-hmm. And no. We're still on the roller coaster. And it looks like it's going to go on for quite some time. So, interesting times, as the Chinese might say.
True. So that's I guess, pro-police, because it gives police less that they have to do? I'm not sure who that helps. It saves the police time.
Well, it's not about helping anybody per se. It's about, again, interpreting the law. Mm-hmm. There's no law that requires the police to inform you of your rights and whatnot. At least, well, maybe that varies by state, but technically there's no constitutional requirement, or at least there had not been before the court case that established Miranda rights. Mm-hmm. And, even that court case was not about ensuring you were informed about your rights. It was about trying to create a barrier to the police tricking you into implicating yourself. That's why people plead the fifth, right? You're not, the legal system and attorneys general and police are not supposed to be able to kind of maneuver you into a position where you can implicate yourself regarding crimes that you're not being investigated for. Mm-hmm. And so how does the Supreme Court interpret that? So the Miranda rights and the requirement for police to recite them was just a barrier, basically, to help inhibit or help protect people from having their Fifth Amendment rights violated. Mm-hmm. And this ruling just doesn't change that per se. It just waters down the restrictions. It's the police are not necessarily going to be violating your rights if they take evidence from you that you kind of implicitly, unknowingly gave while you were being investigated. That's a very rough interpretation. I haven't read as much about that as I have some of the other rulings, but that's the gist of it. And basically, it's just part of this general pattern of much more conservative rulings that have been rolling out. It's not necessarily surprising, but last year, for example, and in the years since the Supreme Court had its conservative majority, the rulings were not really this dramatic. It seems like they've kind of swung for the fences this summer. This seems to be something different. I was of the mind even, a couple weeks ago that the Supreme Court was still a professional institution and that, like you mentioned, that it was the most impartial of the three branches of government. That is to say, the judicial system and the Supreme Court as an institution was the most impartial. And from what I'd been reading, in general, Supreme Court justices are pretty professional, even if they have strong opinions. They generally do a pretty good job of grounding them in sound legal argumentation, and at the same time recognizing the implicit norms that are supposed to manage and govern the judicial branch. But something changed this summer. They had kind of been adhering to all of that up until this summer, but I don't know what broke, but something did. And, it's true even if you look at the Supreme Court as an institution unto itself, because the draft leak was unprecedented. And after the draft leak, there was there was an investigation into who leaked it. That created a lot of paranoia amongst all of the clerks that worked for the Supreme Court justices. And, when you live in interesting times, quote unquote, you learn about the details of systems that you always kind of assumed would work. And because you assumed that they worked fine, you didn't really bother actually learning the nuts and bolts. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not the case anymore. So we're learning some of the nuts and bolts of the Supreme Court as an institution. And one of them, which again is not a written law, this is more of an informal norm that undergirds the Supreme Court as an institution. Law clerks working for the justices actually do a lot of work coordinating with each other and coordinating the different opinions of the justices together in order to hash out differences in opinion, to try to reach a consensus, and to try to observe some of the other implicit norms. Again, trying to be moderate in the rulings and trying not to be too disruptive. That process broke down after that draft leak. From the accounts I've read, a lot of the clerks and the Supreme Court justices themselves became paranoid about talking with each other because there was a sense that they were vulnerable. Because there was a sense that sort of the norm that everything, the deliberations of the court were insular had been broken, and that anything they might say might end up getting leaked. And that implies that the normal process of deliberation was kind of distorted. So that in and of itself is a break from the norm. Never mind sort of the shift away from implicit norms and the rather more conservative interpretation of the Constitution that seems to prevail this summer. Even just the basic functionings, like the nuts and bolts of the Supreme Court as an institution, have been distorted and have been rendered unusual, so to speak. So that's another institution, and in fact, the third and last major institution of the three in U.S. government that is now effectively corrupted to some degree. I don't know if that's going to be a pattern in the future. I would hope not. Judicial independence and the integrity of the judicial system in the United States is one of, if not the most important institutional block undergirding U.S. stability and the success of U.S. politics and the U.S. economy and just about everything else that happens here. So it's going to be bad news if the Supreme Court has this institutional problem that causes it to be dysfunctional going forward. And maybe it's just a temporary thing and it kind of goes away. Maybe the Supreme Court justices themselves moderate. Maybe this summer is just a weird outlier and then things kind of go back to normal, next year. But that's a pretty optimistic interpretation given the general pattern that we've seen over the past 10 years. So I'm not really expecting any further, like I was before, that a return to normality is going to be 5 to 10 years away. It seems like it's not. We came pretty close, I think. We entered a period of instability around 2015 or so. And it looked like there might be some significant changes to the status quo, but they didn't really happen substantively. There was a challenge to the status quo regarding trade with China during the Trump administration. But beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot of substance that changed. And we seemed to be navigating this period without too many major disruptions in the grand scheme of things. And it seemed like if we could preserve political institutions, that we could come out the other end and restore a stable equilibrium. But without the Supreme Court and the judicial system, that's not really feasible. So at this point, it's not about preserving institutions. Again, if the judicial system is in decline, it could again return to normal later. But if this is the last institutional break of the major three in the United States, then the next 10 to 20 years are not going to be about preserving institutions. They're going to be about rebuilding institutions. And that's going to be really important because the sooner we do that, the sooner we can reach a new equilibrium. And if we don't do that, then things just continue to spiral. It's going to be like that scene in what was the movie? Interstellar, right? Where things are just, the space station is just spinning out of control and it's just going faster and faster. That's what you can expect. There has to be some resistance to this in order to correct that. And when I say resistance, I don't mean that there has to be like a correction. It doesn't have to be like a left-wing correction. It just has to be stability, a return to norms, a recognition that institutions need people in them who recognize those norms and observe them, and a sense that there needs to be compromise and moderation and forbearance in all sectors of government in order for political stability to prevail. We really don't have that right now, and it looks like it's going to get worse. So that's kind of my big takeaway more recently.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main things that has made the U.S. as successful as it's been is stability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why our currency as well is one that a lot of countries use just as a reference or as something they can fall back on, is because we have consistency in a lot of our institutions. So as that consistency goes down, there's less faith that we have in our institutions, and thus the world. It's interesting how important stability is. You can look at stuff like the different political swings that we have, but as you're pointing out, as long as things are done the same way they've been done in the past, then people can set their expectations and not really be too surprised. But we've got a flurry of surprises here.
Yeah, boy, ain't that the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that kind of era, I guess. It's strange for me, and if not also for yourself, having grown up in the '90s. That was a period of immense prosperity, stability, predictability to the point where it was boring.
Yeah.
And almost oppressive in the sense that you didn't think anything could ever change. And subsequent years have disproven that notion. And are kind of instilling now an appreciation, I suspect, amongst the younger generation for predictability. I've certainly seen no small amount of accounts to that effect. But certainly it's jarring for me. All of the things that I thought were sort of fixed variables are kind of falling like dominoes at this point. Maybe I could be accused of suffering from 2019 syndrome. I keep thinking in the back of my head, well, if we can get through this, we can get back to where we were. And yeah, it's looking like that's not going to happen. It's looking like the instability is itself the new normal. So navigating that is going to be the big challenge going forward.
There is also the ebb and flow between people being united and people being polarized, and I thought that we had reached a high point of polarization and we were going to swing back to unity on more stuff, but we're still swinging out away from each other. So the left and the right, I think they've always been at odds to some extent. Growing up, I don't remember it being quite this extreme, but I was a kid. But it would be like people on the left would call George W. Bush dumb, but it wasn't really, I don't know, it didn't seem as intense as it is now. And with the Trump administration, he was an extremely polarizing figure where some people loved him and worshipped him and other people thought he was the worst president we've ever had. And then the swing continues now with the Supreme Court swinging in a political direction that a lot of people maybe didn't anticipate based on their behavior over the past several decades. For a quick rundown of, it's 9 justices, correct?
Yeah.
What are the approximate political orientations of them? Because I think there's a conservative majority, and then you said there's one guy who kind of waffles, and he'll go against his party line, so to speak.
Well, in general, it's not really about ideologies. It's more about legal philosophies. But in general, people tend to take a more originalist approach to the people who take a more originalist approach to interpreting the Constitution are generally considered the more conservative ones.
What does
And
originalist mean?
basically, there's this idea that, you know, do you take the rules written in the Constitution and do you interpret it in a way that fits the context into which they were written originally in the late 1700s or, in later decades in the case of the amendments? Or alternatively, do you interpret those rules differently depending on a modern context? In other words, do you take the spirit and intention of those rules and adjust them to fit current circumstances? So the latter approach is a more liberal approach, and that's generally associated more with the left wing of U.S. politics. And it's more that school of thought that resulted in things like the integration of the school system, the ending of segregation, etc. They took old interpretations. Well, I guess in the case of civil rights, they took the original interpretation and applied it correctly. But in other cases, they've definitely broadened the scope of rights based off of a somewhat ambiguous and abstract interpretation of the Constitution, rather than a more literal reading that fit more specifically with the original context into which it was written back in the 1700s and 1800s. So the originalist legal philosophy is what's being applied more recently. That's very much undergirding sort of the Dobbs case that overthrew Roe v. Wade, and also that the New York gun law case. They even said in their opinions that there weren't any such rules. There was no such interpretation of the Constitution in the 1700s. And so because of that, then it cannot be inferred that the Constitution extends these kinds of protections. So it's you can accuse it of being backwards, but it's legitimate. It's backwards in the sense that it creates a very low bar as far as constitutional protection, which is very much not in the spirit of the Constitution, which was designed to protect individual rights. But on the other hand, the justification for this kind of legal philosophy is that it puts the impetus on legislators and the representatives of the public to interpret the Constitution rather than putting the impetus on judges, whom are generally unelected, depending on your state, but certainly at the federal level, are unelected. And because they're unelected, they cannot really be said to be they cannot be said to really represent the public's preferences as much as elected representatives in, say, Congress or the executive branch. So, yes, it's kind of goofy to argue that, the law written, the Constitution written in the 1700s has to be interpreted only in an 18th century context. But on the other hand, the purpose behind that logic is to push legislators to rule and be more explicit about how the Constitution should be modernized and interpreted in a modern context. Now, of course, the trouble with that is that we don't really live in a time where legislators do things,
Yeah.
even a lot of basic things. So the idea that there's going to be some kind of consensus in which all the legislators get together in Congress and say, okay, this is how the Constitution should be interpreted now in order to fit our current circumstances. The likelihood that there's ever going to be that kind of consensus is very, very low. And so what that means implicitly is that by interpreting the Constitution in this way, you're basically just limiting protections for individuals. And that's definitely not what I feel the Constitution was written to do. It's not just what I feel. It's not what it was written to do. It was meant to protect rights. And certainly you can't blame the judicial branch for the inability of the legislative branch to do what it's supposed to do, which is represent the will of the public. But at the same time, I think it's very ideologically inflexible to insist on interpreting the law this way when you know implicitly, and by extension, that the legislative branch isn't going to hold up its end of the bargain, so to speak, and that the end result is going to be less constitutional protections, one way or the other.
Yeah, it sort of feels like a kicking the can down the road kind of thing of, well, we don't want to figure this out. You guys figure it out. But they're kicking the can to, like you're saying,
Abyss.
legislators that are better at screaming at each other than actually reaching a consensus on stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of the flaw I feel in the reasoning there. So I don't think that's going to work. And again, like we started with, there's going to be instability that comes out of this. There's going to be a lot of litigation and a lot of activism and a lot of, probably, I would guess, a fair amount of radicalism as well. Certainly, if you talk to people on the left, the past 10 years have had nothing if not a radicalizing effect. And I might add here that one of the problems with the ruling is not really the ruling itself. Again, I think it's a technically sound ruling. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not even saying that abortion is ethically right or wrong. I'm looking just solely from the technical side. It was technically sound. The only issue I would have is the breach of norms. That's a problem. But there's also another issue, which is, of course, the way that the recent appointees to the Supreme Court were appointed. So, of course, there was the example of Barack Obama having a chance to appoint a judge, but then he missed the opportunity because Republicans in the Senate stonewalled until after the 2016 election, which is itself weird. That hadn't really been done before. So that was a breach of norms, and it resulted in an additional conservative justice where there would not have been otherwise. And then they did it again. They did it again in, what was it, 2019, 2020. There was another opening. They could have waited until after the 2020 election, but instead they rushed through an appointment, and they got another one. And of course, Biden ended up winning the 2020 election. So the result is that, again, there's another conservative justice where there would not have been if they had been consistent. So if breaching norms is how you get your way as far as the Supreme Court and the judicial branch, why would you do that if you're a Democrat? It obviously works. If you're from the Republican perspective and from the general ideological perspective, regardless of whatever wing of politics you're on, this kind of behavior works. That's the lesson. That's the precedent being set. And that's bad news, because that means all the other ideologues in the United States are going to try to do the same thing. And that just results in a tit-for-tat series of escalations that results in political dysfunction. Like, you can't just keep breaching norms over and over again without retaliation. And if retaliation continues by one side and the other over time, then eventually you don't have any norms. And there's no political system on earth that exists or has existed or that can exist, that can even be designed, that can function without respect and recognition of norms. So that's what we're on track for now. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to argue against that. Like, I can't tell people on the left that, hey, don't do that. It's not going to work and it's going to be bad news in the future. Well, it does work. It's still going to be bad news in the future, but I can hardly deter them at this point, given that there are people on the right who have already been doing it and have now done it successfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's basically fighting dirty has been working, but that's not really the best way to go about things in the long term, because it incentivizes the other side to fight dirty if they want to keep pace.
Yeah. Pareto equilibrium would be if everybody recognized and respected the norms. But we don't have that. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to end up with is a prisoner's dilemma game where it makes more sense to cooperate, but both sides now have to defect, because that's what makes more sense at an individual level. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's pretty fucked. There's not really any other way to describe that. That's pending institutional failure in U.S. politics, and there seems to be no real way to arrest it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then the other thing that I'm not sure if people from outside the U.S. know, but our Supreme Court justices are a lifetime appointment, which means you basically can keep your job until you die or retire. But you don't have like a term limit per se that says, all right, you've been on the Supreme Court for 40 years. Let's do other stuff now. It's like, nope, you can still be there. So we have very old representation. You can argue that with age comes wisdom, but there's also the sort of distance between some current and modern issues and people who are much older. So yeah, it's going to be slow change, it feels like. If you want to have a sort of swing back to where things are a little bit more even representation, between what is this originalist
Yeah,
political philosophy
originalist.
and a more kind of spirit of the law approach.
Hmm.
It's going to take decades.
Probably. I mean, maybe not. Again, tit for tat series of escalations is going to come. Like, I have a hard time not seeing it happen at this point. So what that means is that stacking the court is no longer really off the table.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is basically a borderline ideological declaration of war. And I don't really see how the left doesn't respond in kind,
Mm-hmm.
which means that it's just going to escalate. So stacking the courts, yeah, I mean, why not at this point? How can you argue against it at this point?
Yeah. If they do it, why
Like,
shouldn't we do it?
so there's that. That's one possible solution. And then, of course, the other solution, which I am not advocating, but given how much US politics is going to be radicalized over the next 10 to 20 years, uh, assassinations. If you don't have your preferred composition on the Supreme Court, you can always just kill your way to your preferred composition. And again, I don't condone that, but given that the justices are not elected and given that their rulings are having dramatic effects on the status quo, it's going to get harder and harder to dissuade radicals from doing shit like that.
So I know we've had some U.S. presidents who have been assassinated. Have we had justices in the past?
None that I'm aware of. People don't really pay much attention to the Supreme Court historically. They might bitch them out, like they did during the 1930s, but I don't think anybody ever tried to assassinate any of them.
Well, they're paying attention to the Supreme Court now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was one of the errors. Again, just from an institutional perspective, one of the errors that they've made is that they have now locked the Supreme Court into the spin cycle of partisan American politics. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Yeah.
That's not a good place to be. It almost is, it just ensures that nothing of substance will be done. So now that they're locked into that, the court's legitimacy is very much in question. And I don't know how to fix that, or if it can be fixed. That could just be a generational problem. These are really the kinds of problems that you solve by not incurring them in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of missed the boat on that, it seems. So now we get to deal with that. So it's anybody's guess how that pans out in the long term.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I've been seeing people mention is since Roe v. Wade was overturned, there are a couple other rulings that were ruled in a similar capacity in a similar time frame.
Yeah.
One of them was gay marriage. Another one was interracial marriage. And then I forget what the third one was. I think it might just be being LGBT.
No, it was the butt sex one.
Oh, the butt sex one. Right.
Yeah.
Sodomy
That was,
laws.
that was the weird one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not being overly flippant either. That's literally what happened. There was a guy who had a warrant out for his arrest. The police in Texas went to his house, busted down the door to arrest him, and they just, sheer happenstance, they happened to bust down the door right while he was in the middle of having sex with his boyfriend. And so, they were going to arrest him for the other stuff already, but they just kind of threw the book at him, okay, well, we caught you breaking the state sodomy law, so we're also going to charge you with that. And so that's the law that ended up before the Supreme Court.
Well,
It was a weird case, but it ended up with the Supreme Court ruling, striking down the Texas state sodomy laws. And as a result, those laws have now been, were rendered unconstitutional. Yeah, it's just one of those things. But yeah, you're right. That was also a result of applying the due process clause. All of the ones you mentioned were.
mm-hmm.
So all of those are cases where, in the case of gay marriage, sodomy, and also what were called miscegenation laws, basically interracial marriage, all of those technically could be undone using the logic that was used most recently. Some people online were making fun of Justice Thomas for not mentioning the miscegenation law rulings in his brief.
Yeah, because his wife is white.
His wife is white and quite crazy, I might add,
Yeah, she
given some of the
was.
things.
I heard she was kind of tied in with some of the January 6th stuff.
Yeah, yeah, she was. She was kind of making phone calls, trying to make the argument that they needed to stop Biden from getting elected. She was kind of, yeah, she was involved, quote unquote. So that was funny. I just kind of got a kick out of that. But yeah, certainly Justice Thomas, in his opinion, made the case that the court should revisit those other cases that you mentioned, not the miscegenation one, but certainly sodomy, gay marriage, and then there was a third one too. I don't quite remember. Chat knows what it is. I'm sure they can pitch in there. I'll do the usual disclaimer now before I forget. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, especially with law stuff. That's the bane of my existence. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased on here, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So participation is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this because I'm dumb, but I will read it later. And I do get a lot out of the feedback we get on this and listening to you guys, kind of listening to your input that you have in chat and whatnot.
But don't you have to say stupid stuff when you're telling us the news and stupid stuff is happening?
Well, it helps if I know more about it, such that I can be as informed as possible. So sometimes I don't have all of the information. In my defense, there's a lot of stuff happening that I need to read about, and it's hard to keep on top of it and keep my alcoholic cat alive in RimWorld.
Yeah.
It's a difficult juggling act.
We've got potential sexual position laws on the books, which, man, why would you want people in robes deciding what you can do with your partners? Let's not go there.
Well, to be fair to the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas was kind of alone on the idea of revisiting those other cases. In fact, Alito, one of the other big conservative court justices there, in his opinion, which is the one that all of the other conservative justices, except for Thomas, signed on to, basically said that abortion was special, it was unique, and that not applying the due process clause to that specific area did not, in his opinion, and in the opinion of most of the other conservative justices, inherently mean that they needed to revisit other similar cases where due process logic was used. So it's not inevitable that we're going to see these other rights, other constitutional protections that had been granted via due process clause interpretations of the 14th Amendment revoked. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's a question at all is disconcerting. Certainly, if you believe that those rights are important and should be protected by the Constitution. And that's going to be a problem. Just again, from a legitimacy perspective and a stability perspective, people don't like living with the sword of Damocles hanging over their head.
For people who don't know, what is the sword of Damocles?
Sort of. Actually, that's a good question. It's a Greek myth. I think it's a Greek myth. I think it's a Greek myth wherein the sword of I guess I don't know. Wow.
Chad, what is the sword of Damocles?
What is the sword of Damocles? That's something I guess I just always assumed I knew what was, and then you asked, and I was like, actually, what is the sword of Damocles? I thought it was a Greek myth. But I guess it's also a colloquialism that's used to refer to situations where you're living in perpetual anxiety when you don't know what's going to happen and you're afraid that something bad is going to happen to you. So in such circumstances, you're said to be living under the sword of Damocles. But as for the origins of the saying, now that you mention, I guess I don't know.
It's an ancient Protoss myth.
There you go.
Messing with us. We're making no progress here.
But yeah, that's going to be the problem. There's going just to be the fact that people are going to be living with legal uncertainty as to whether or not their whole way of life or even their existence is going to be legal is itself going to create a lot of instability and consternation in U.S. politics. And it's well timed because we definitely live in an era where we don't have anything else to worry about.
That's sarcasm.
That is sarcasm.
The rare Agent Smith sarcasm, you love to see it.
Yeah, we're kind of dealing with some other issues globally that you may have heard of. There's a lot of revanchism amongst certain this, that, and the other old former imperial powers.
Ah, speak of Ukraine.
Well, more like the country invading Ukraine, but yes. There's also a new country, well, not a new country, but there's a country that's newly powerful and that has a lot of economic influence and increasingly political influence around the world. You'd think that trying to figure out how to deal with that would be pretty important too.
China?
China,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And there's also a lot of questions about liberal democracy and the health therein in the Western world. So you'd think that would also be of concern. But instead, we're going to be arguing about abortion for a while, which is an important issue to a lot of people. I don't want to downplay that, but it's taking up bandwidth that we could really use in some other important areas right now. Say la vie.
Yeah, I think one of those elements too is like, how do citizens of a nation prioritize their own like personal issues versus world issues? Balancing all of that seems pretty tricky.
It does.
Like,
You know, I remember when I was studying World War II, when I was big World War II history buff and as a kid. And, I noticed that some people at the time, commentary from the 1940s, some people expressed surprise that the nation was able to kind of mobilize and unify as much as it did, and that they were really pleased by that. And I remember thinking, well, how could it be otherwise? Certainly during a major crisis, the country would come together, right? It seemed strange to me to think otherwise. And then the 2020s happened. It's not so surprising now. I very much share the perspective. The older you get, the more you learn.
also, the more you get entrenched in your beliefs and such.
Very true.
Yeah, the way that I think about personal beliefs, and this applies to religious beliefs, political beliefs, the longer that you hold a position, the more time you've committed, kind of like currency, into that belief. And the more stupid you look if you change your opinion later on. So a lot of times people, I think, get, to use a poker term, pot committed to a belief system. Generally speaking, I would say when people are in their 40s or so, they're pretty much set and they're looking for stability over risk and change. So, yeah. You have justices who are very old. You have people in the legislature who are very old. You have presidents who are very old. We have lots of old in American politics right now.
Yeah, maybe that wouldn't even be a problem if they weren't from the 1960s. I think a lot of them are still litigating the culture wars from that era, which we really don't need. Culture wars are never really a net positive for any political system, but people can't get enough of them either. I noticed that American culture wars have been exported now to other countries. If you look at media in India, the way that media channels operate is very similar to the most partisan media channels in the United States. And there's a brewing sort of culture war politics in India that's become increasingly prominent. And it's something you can kind of see in other developing democracies too. So, yet another fine export from the United States there that we've proliferated around the world.
Do we have any good news?
Fuck no.
Oh,
What era do you think you live in?
he says with swiftness and conviction.
Good news. Come on. This isn't the kind of era where you try to find the good news. This is the kind of era where you try to deal with the bad news. If we had dealt with some of these issues back when times were better, things would not be so bad now. So avoiding them is definitely not a good idea. It's only going to get even worse if we keep ignoring them. Being proactive is the solution here, not burying our heads in the sand. That's how we got here.
Right. Tough out the downswings, and we're still in a downswing.
Yeah. Yeah, the real question that people should be asking right now is not how could this happen? Not just, the Roe v. Wade thing, just like any of the stuff that's happened around the world recently. Regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, it would be easy to just say, how could this happen? This can't be real, blah, blah, blah. You can freak out, you can panic. None of that matters. The question you have to ask is, what do you do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And I really have not seen enough of that for me to have any real confidence that these problems are actually going to be substantively addressed. I think maybe the closest we've come is Ukraine, just because that's pressing. That's a very obvious problem, and it's not as easy to ignore. People are still trying, and we may yet end up ignoring it, which is going to have some dire consequences. But for now, at least, people are sufficiently invested to continue support. So we haven't screwed that up yet.
Mm-hmm.
But there are plenty of other problems where there's just not sufficient mobilization to actually reach any kind of stable outcome, to actually address the problem in a substantive way. And until that happens, I'm not really all that confident that we're going to exit this period of instability anytime soon.
Yeah, we need a unifying issue. It seems like the war in Ukraine sort of is, but it's a little bit too far from home for people to set aside their like personal wag the dog issues and focus on that. That's more of like a, for the higher ups, how much aid do they end up sending over, which still matters for sure, but it's less of a like the local people's issue. But I guess something like this abortion topic, like people have strong opinions on it everywhere. But other countries aren't really tackling this. I guess this might be all connected to the wave of populism over the past several years.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in the case of this ruling, it's basically a kind of delayed reaction to the election of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
This is the kind of stuff that you would have expected to happen during Trump's tenure, but as is, it ended up happening a couple years after he left office.
Well, you could say domino effect. That's because of the justice swing was like a delayed effect.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. So it's definitely a part of that same period, and definitely a part of the one of the consequences of the decisions made in that period. So in that sense, maybe you could argue that, oh, this is just a delayed reaction from the middle of the last decade. We're still in general doing better, and we can get past this too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. That's a pretty charitable assessment, I would argue, at this point. Let's see. So what's going to happen on abortion now? So I tried to kind of war game this a little bit just to try to see how the different actors involved would behave. What kinds of actions do they take? And then what kind of tit-for-tat actions does the other side retaliate with? So I tried to just kind of draw up a rough list. So for one, alternative services. So I'm going to look at pro-abortion and then anti-abortion here. And, well, okay, pro-choice, pro-life. Those are the American euphemisms we like to use here. So pro-choice. So there's going to be a focus on how to provide alternative services, right? Obviously, if you live in a conservative state, you're not going to be able to get an abortion. So what do you do about that? And I would point out here, for those of you living outside of the United States who maybe don't know how this is going to technically work, they're not going to go after women, at least for now, who get abortions. That's not going to be illegal. What's going to be illegal is performing the abortion. So it's the doctors that they're going to go after. Any health professional that performs an abortion is going to be imprisoned if they can be, caught and convicted. Mm-hmm. So if you're pro-choice, how do you get around this? So one of the things you can do is teleconferencing. If you want to get, say, a prescription for a abortifacient, in other words, an abortion pill, for example, most abortions happen pretty early in the pregnancy. So for those, you can do a chemical abortion using a pill. And I think there are two different pills that are used to do that, which are relatively cheap, relatively available. Technically, you have to get a prescription for them, although that's probably going to change in pro-choice states. Pro-life states will probably make it harder, but regardless, you need a prescription to get it. So in order to get a prescription, you're probably going to have to go out of state, but instead of actually physically going out of state, you can just do it over the internet. You can just go to a guy, send him your medical stuff, your medical information, maybe proof of your pregnancy, and then they can say, okay, well, you're clear to use such and such chemical abortifacient. And then they'll write you a prescription for one of the two abortion pills, and then you can go and pick them up. No doctor in, say, Texas is going to do that, but a doctor in, say, New York or California probably would. But, caveat, Texas has already actually banned, as I learned in the past week. Again, you learn a lot more about the nuts and bolts of things when shit starts going weird. So, Texas actually has a law in the books banning the use of telehealth, as it's called, quote unquote, to get abortions, or to organize abortions, or to get abortion pills, or what have you. So technically, that's already illegal. So what that means is that if you're a doctor on the other end of that phone call, you basically just can't come to Texas, because if you do, you'll be arrested and then go to jail. So how do you get around that? So technically, well, not technically, but if you're a doctor in, say, Canada or Mexico, which is the more likely case if you're living in Texas, probably not going to go to Texas too much. It's probably not on your agenda. So in that case, having a bunch of people in, say, again, Texas, I live in Texas, so I use it as an example a lot. If you're living in Texas and you want to get a doctor's prescription, you could hypothetically teleconference with a doctor in Canada or Mexico, and then you could hypothetically get a prescription from them that you could use to get whatever kind of abortion pill it is you need. So again, those doctors would still be liable under the law, but because they live in other countries and aren't likely to travel to, say, Texas in the first place, it's probably not that big a deal. So you're more likely to find services there, and those services will probably pop up, I would expect, either legally or illegally, regardless of what the laws in the countries relevant are, just because that's going to be a lucrative market. You know, you can charge a fee for the service of providing the prescription and doing the teleconference thing, and so that's going to be easy money. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to try for that, so it's going to be a pretty decent-sized market. So that's going to pop up probably very quickly within the next couple of months in Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico, more like. Again, it could happen in pro-choice states within the U.S., but again, a lot of doctors do a lot of traveling. They go to conferences, and Texas is actually a center of that. It's an important part of the health industrial complex, so to speak, in the United States. So there's going to be a fair number of doctors in the U.S. who are not going to be willing to forego the ability and right to travel to Texas. Some will. You'll find some, but I suspect there's going to be a lot more who will be happy to do it in Canada or Mexico because it's a lot more low stakes for them and, again, easy money. Also, there's probably less regulations there anyway, so it's probably just easier. So that's a battle that you can look forward to. Texas is going to take note of that, and, well, not just Texas, but pro-life states, such as they're called, will notice that, and they're going to try to inhibit that somehow. It's going to be really hard. It's already going to be hard to try to enforcing the telehealth restriction that was passed. You know, I don't even know how you really do that beyond someone just informing on you or something. But regardless, they're going to make an effort. One of the ideas that I had that they might try is they might try to pass a law either, well, probably at the state level, but possibly at the federal level if they can. They can try to make it impossible to get a prescription from foreign doctors. Somebody maybe more familiar with the law can maybe correct me on this. You know, maybe it's already the case that there are restrictions on the ability to get prescriptions from foreign doctors, but I would imagine that the United States has agreements with certain states where there is mutual recognition of accreditation. So in those states, I would expect it to be possible. But if you're pro-life, you could try to restrict mutual recognition of accreditation such that it becomes more difficult, if not impossible, to get prescriptions from doctors in those states. thereby making it much more difficult for people seeking abortions to get the prescriptions they need for the abortion pills that they want. So you can kind of see how this kind of gets into weird legal territory. We started with abortions, and now we're talking about mutual recognition of accreditation. This is the kind of thing I was talking about when I said there was going to be a lot of litigation, because there's going to be laws passed one way or the other about this at the state and federal level, trying to make it easier or harder, or even to ban it or to make it explicitly legal. So all of that is going to be a war zone, politically and legally, going forward. Something to look forward to. There's also abortion pills by mail. So instead of trying to get a prescription for them, you could just try to get them mailed from a state where you can get them over the counter, or maybe even from a country where you could get them over the counter. This is already banned in Texas again, which already has a law that says you have to see a doctor in person when being prescribed abortion pills. But it's also kind of a difficult law to enforce. And if Texas tries to extend jurisdiction to states where this is legal, then there's going to be a constitutional problem, because regulation of interstate commerce is exclusively the purview of the federal government. So the federal government would probably get involved then, and the Supreme Court would presumably shoot that down. Unless, of course, the federal government passed some kind of law in which it was regulated. But that remains to be seen. That hasn't been done yet. But that's also going to be a political battle going forward at some point. So regardless, people are going to try to get these pills by mail. It's going to be really difficult to enforce. Even if the federal government passes its own laws barring the transmission of abortion pills by mail, almost impossible to enforce, or at least very difficult. And even if they succeed in enforcing it, that just moves the market overseas. So now you're going to get the pills mailed from Mexico or Canada again. So at that point, it turns into a trade battle. So this is another example of it getting into weird territory. This is going to be a part of trade policy. The United States government, if it has a conservative government that is pro-life, is going to try to lean on states like Canada and Mexico that the US does a lot of trade with in order to get them to themselves implement rules that restrict the export of abortifacients, or to agree to trade restrictions or to agree to assist in trade restrictions that will inhibit the trade of those abortifacients. Again, it's going to be a mess.
Basically leaning on them and saying, you guys should do this too.
Yeah, it's going to percolate all through public policy. And it's just going to be super thorny and fraught territory if you're, say, a lazy public policy guy who doesn't want to get involved in it. I don't begrudge people in that position at all. Because invariably, if you don't do anything, if you don't enforce a law, say, banning abortifacients and whatnot, then the pro-life ideologues are mad at you. If you do enforce them, then all of the pro-choice advocates and ideologues are going to be mad at you. So you're kind of fucked no matter what you do. And again, like I said earlier, not good for political stability. Going to be pretty hard. So those are just some alternative services that the pro-choice crowd could try to provide, and some of the things that the pro-life crowd will try to respond with. Also something else, and this is something we've already seen happening, pro-choice states, pro-choice NGOs, and even pro-choice companies in the private sector could provide funds and accommodations for women who want to travel to pro-choice jurisdictions to get an abortion. So there's already been some companies, some tech companies that have said that they will fund their employees' travel expenses if they need to get an abortion in another state. NGOs are going to do that, and some states, I think California has already said that they're going to try to help women trying to come to the state for abortions, or at least they said they would make California a bastion for women's reproductive rights, something corny to that effect. So that's going to be an effort. So that means that there's going to be a corresponding effort to inhibit that legally. So you can look for NGOs, what would you call them, family planning NGOs or reproductive rights NGOs or feminist NGOs. Those are going to be targeted, most likely, at least in so much as they're engaging in activity that can be construed to encourage and abet abortions, be they in conservative states or in pro-choice states. So there's going to be a legal battle over whether the state can restrict those kinds of activities, since, if you're just giving people information and giving them some money to get an abortion, that's not technically violating rules that prohibit medical professionals from performing abortions. So where do you draw the line on that? Do NGOs have the freedom just to disseminate information and provide financial assistance to people? That'll be thorny. I suspect the law will probably be more on the pro-choice side in that case, but that's never stopped. That's never stopped anybody in U.S. politics. So there's probably still going to be a big push on the part of the pro-life crowd to try to inhibit it. So let's see, legal assistance. There's going to be a push to provide legal assistance to women who are targeted, either for abetting abortion or for medical professionals who are performing abortions. I think there was Uber. I think it was Uber, the company that provides the ride-sharing company. Mm-hmm. So they said that not only would they provide funds to help pay for employees who were traveling to get abortions, they also said that they would provide legal cover. Well, not legal cover, but they would provide funds to cover legal expenses for employees who were providing rides to people who were traveling, say, out of state to get an abortion. That's relevant because there's been some talk about banning people from, making it illegal to travel outside of a state to get an abortion. So that could also be a legal battle. So in that case, Uber is saying that if one of their drivers were implicated in doing that, they would help them with legal fees and whatnot. So let's see. And jurisdictional battles, I kind of already mentioned that. Basically, pro-choice states have already said that they're not going to cooperate with anti-abortion states in enforcing abortion laws. So in New York, for example, the state basically prohibited law enforcement agencies from cooperating with law enforcement agencies in the pro-life states as far as enforcing abortion laws, which could be squarely constitutionally. There's supposed to be recognition of what was it? Like a driver's license in one state has to be recognized in another one. So there could be similar squirrely things happening, because it could be that pro-choice or pro-life states rather could try to apply some kind of label or documentation or whatnot to women or, again, legal professionals who perform abortions that technically, constitutionally, other states will be required to observe. I'm not sure how that would work in practice, but I have heard some people advocate for that. So there's going to be some push and pull about jurisdiction and cross, interstate commerce, and in so much as the federal government can regulate that, whether or not the federal government should jump in. And given that that's a power that the federal government could just kind of implement, they can just pass a law, hypothetically, assuming they have the constitutional power to do it, the federal government could just pass a law making traveling interstate for an abortion illegal. If that's the case, then the next time the Democrats are in control of Congress, presumably both houses, they could just reverse that. So the result is that federal abortion laws could come to resemble federal foreign aid assistance to abortion NGOs in Africa. I guess in the developing world generally, but Africa is disproportionately affected. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, the U.S. provides a lot of some financial aid anyway to NGOs that provide assistance to people in developing countries, especially Africa. But there's a question of whether the U.S. government should be extending those funds to NGOs that also provide family planning services that sometimes involve abortion. So, of course, if you're pro-life, you say no. So what happens is that every time there's a Republican president, since it's the president that has discretion over this, the U.S. pulls foreign aid funding from those NGOs. And then when there's a Democrat in office, they restore funding to those NGOs. And it's just been back and forth, for the past several decades, ever since foreign aid funding for these NGOs became politicized, basically. So there could be something similar with federal regulations of interstate commerce relevant to abortion, where the law just kind of changes with the political winds, which, again, not great for stability. It's better to have predictability and continuity in politics, but that's not where we're headed. So that's something else to look forward to. So there's also going to be municipal battles. If you are a pro-choice locality or municipality in a pro-life state, you're kind of in an interesting position right now. Living in Dallas, I can attest to this. Dallas in general is fairly pro-abortion or pro-choice or however you want to frame it. And so there's been some panic here. I've already got friends on Facebook who are very much concerned about this, talking about sterilization services. I already have one friend who got sterilized after the draft leak. You know, she's very much on the left side of the political spectrum, and she was very concerned that Gilead was on the horizon, and so she all but rushed to get sterilized when the draft leak was made. And now there's a lot of friends of hers on Facebook, some of them I haven't even met, who are asking her about the procedure. So borderline panic basically is how you might describe the situation in some of the blue cities and red states, at least from what I've seen amongst some of the people I know on that side of the political spectrum. So there's going to be a lot, and that's putting it mildly, a lot of political pressure on city governments to do everything they can to fight against anti-abortion legislation at the state level. And there may be limits to what they can realistically do. I don't think abortion is going to be able to continue legally, for example, regardless of what kinds of protections cities may extend. But as I've kind of illustrated with my previous comments on the matter, there's lots of other legal battles that are pending. And cities can definitely play a part in that, even if they're in a pro-life state. So some of the things they could do, for one, is the obvious stuff. And a lot of this parallels similar activity regarding immigration. So one thing cities could do is non-enforcement of state abortion laws. Cities can pass ordinances or even just outright laws that prohibit city law enforcement from cooperating with state law enforcement in the enforcement of abortion laws or even in abortion investigations. Also, well, I guess that's non-cooperation. Non-enforcement would be prohibiting the enforcement of state abortion laws. So you can't arrest medical practitioners who may or may not have been involved in performing abortions. So non-enforcement and non-cooperation regarding state abortion laws. Those are two things that cities are going to be pushed to do and probably will do. They've actually already done that on immigration. You know, cities like Dallas, for example, are safe haven excuse me, are safe haven cities, which means that local law enforcement cannot basically assist federal or I think even state law enforcement in enforcing immigration law. And they can't arrest people for being undocumented immigrants, and I don't think they're even supposed to ask about immigration status. So there's something similar that's going to happen with abortion there. There's also going to be a push for city governments to support family planning services at a city level. That's not going to involve abortion per se, but city family planning NGOs and other family planning services could go right up to the line. They can provide you with information about abortions, where you can go to get an abortion, the cheapest way to get an abortion, etc. That has not been banned yet. So all of that is technically still legal, and cities are going to be pushed to help provide services like that. Again, they can't provide abortions directly, but they can provide all of the information, maybe even some financing in the form of some kind of healthcare voucher or other services in order to ensure, or at least help women who want abortions in red states to still be able to get them. So that's going to be another political battle at a city level, which I suspect the pro-choice crowd will win, and then a battle at the state and probably also the federal level. And it's not clear who would win that battle. Let's see, gray markets. This is a fun one. So there's a couple of things that are going to happen regardless of the politics as far as the market for abortions. And one of those is going to be gray markets. If you don't know what a gray market is, that's a market for a good or service that kind of exists in legally dubious territory. It's not a black market, which is a good or service that's explicitly sold illegally. Gray markets regard goods or services that are kind of sort of illegal in certain circumstances and are maybe being sold illegally, or at least in ways that are legally ambiguous. So abortion provision is going to have its own gray markets emerge, especially in red states. So I already mentioned family planning in pro-life states. I've already read that some family planning agencies and NGOs are going to shut down because they got a lot of funding from the provision of abortions, and since that's been cut off, they just aren't going to have the money necessary to continue operating. But there's going to be others that are going to basically cut costs and are still going to try to provide some services and will basically act as intermediaries with abortion providers in third-party locations, either in pro-choice states where it's still legal, or possibly in some kind of other site, alternative site in the pro-life state somewhere where it will be provided illegally, basically. So that'll be another legal battle. Informal networks of underground abortion providers, that's pretty much inevitable. That's what it was like before abortion was constitutionally protected, so that's going to come back invariably. Hopefully it's less dangerous than it was before. There was a number of women who suffered on account of some of the problems that were made by slipshod abortion providers. It could be that that works out. I would expect that civil society in the United States, which tends to be very proactive, will mobilize in order to try to ensure the continuity and quality of services to people living in pro-life states. The degree to which they'll be able to actually do that is going to vary, and partly it's going to depend on crackdowns by the state, since invariably the pro-life crowd, I keep having to split hairs between pro-life and pro-choice, pro-life authorities and pro-life states are going to mobilize to try to crack down on what they're going to consider a black market for abortions. And so informal networks of underground basic abortion service providers, they're going to be targeted by that. So what they can do is try to abstract away from providing the abortions in state and provide them out of state, and that would grant them some legal cover. So whether or not the state can still stop you from, say, receiving payment for an abortion and receiving information and other things from an underground provider, and then having them basically drive you out of state for it, whether or not that is still going to be legal is itself going to be litigated. And that kind of ties into some of the other issues that I've talked about, but this is just going to be another one. The other ones were family planning NGOs or even governments, local governments, but in this case it would actually be underground providers. They're not going to be like licensed or anything. It's just going to be like a dude. And in that case, it's not clear where the law will kind of fall, but I'm sure there will be laws passed to try to address it soon. Let's see. And I also kind of mentioned this before. There's going to be service providers that set up just outside of the border of states where abortion is illegal. So, for example, in the case of Texas, there's probably going to be abortion sites. Well, not abortion sites per se, but family planning centers, whatever you want to call them, that are set up right across the border in, say, New Mexico and probably in Mexico itself. Oklahoma had been a state that did that for Texans, but that's going away since Oklahoma is also one of the states that's going to ban it. So there's going to be, that's not really a gray market per se, that's going to be legal, but most of their customers are going to be from Texas. So in that sense, it's kind of legally dubious. Legally ambiguous, I should say. And let's see. Oh, this is a fun one, too. I was reading about this just today. There's apparently an NGO that specializes in providing abortions in international waters. They even have their own ship. It's an NGO called Women on Waves. And they take their boat to different parts of the world where abortion is illegal, and they provide information, expertise, and whatnot about abortions. And if anybody wants one, they'll actually boat them over to their ship, which they have conveniently located in international waters, and then they'll actually perform the abortion there, where it's technically not going to be illegal. And then they boat them back to wherever they came from. So we could do that here. So Texas can enjoy the fruits and attention of an NGO that normally provides services to developing countries. That's also very exciting and a sign of the times.
That's interesting. It kind of makes me wonder, what are the laws if you're in international waters? Because I think certain waters are the territory of a country.
Yeah, that's like economic exclusion zone. So in that case, it's not that your laws apply there. It's just that you have, that is to say, people in your country have exclusive claim on resources in those territories. So the government has the right to license them or claim them or even exploit them themselves, and otherwise to protect the legal property of people who own property within that territory. But that's not the same thing as extending full jurisdiction to that territory. So international waters, even if they fall within a country's exclusive economic zone, are not fully subject to the laws of that country. So technically, you could get an abortion in the U.S. economic exclusion zone, even though it would technically still be in U.S. territory.
Sea of Whiskey in the chat is saying that it depends on which country the ship is registered in, which laws they abide by on the boat.
It's a good question. I don't know what country that their ship, that is to say, Women on Waves, what country they would have registered their ship in.
If it was registered in the U.S., they're going to need to change the registration.
Well, it probably wasn't registered in the US. A lot of ships are registered in countries where registration fees are really cheap. And actually, there are certain countries that specialize in that and make a lot of money off of it. I think the two countries that I know off the top of my head, and I think these are the main ones, are Greece and Panama. So they purposely set registration fees for ships very, very low. And as a result, a huge proportion of cargo ships around the world are actually registered in Panama and Greece, even though virtually none of them have been built in those countries or do commerce even in those countries. They're just flagged under those countries' governments because they just happen to have the cheapest administrative fees. So if I had to guess, I would say they probably registered under one of those two countries just to save money. NGOs are not generally super wealthy, so I would guess that's what they would have done just to cut costs. But it could be that there are legal reasons they might have registered in another country. I don't know. I don't know enough about the relevant law in that case. But I don't think it would be the US. Hardly anybody registers their ships in the US anymore. There probably wouldn't really be any if not for the Jones Act. I've been hearing about the Jones Act more in my Twitter feed recently. I subscribe to a bunch of Twitter feeds. Well, not a bunch of Twitter feeds. Institutions, basically. I subscribe to a bunch of think tanks on Twitter so that I could basically improve the quality of my Twitter feed so that it would be just more data and analysis instead of people screaming at each other, basically. So as a result, one of the think tanks I have is the Cato Institute. And that's more right-leaning. I try to kind of keep it balanced. I have think tanks from different parts of the political spectrum, but one of the ones on the right I have is the Cato Institute. And they've just got this weird fixation about the Jones Act. Like it almost doesn't matter what topic they're tweeting about. They almost invariably find a way to rope the Jones Act into it somehow, just to connect the Jones Act to it. It's weird. But if you don't know what the Jones Act is, for those of you who don't know, or who are perhaps not rabid libertarians associated with the Cato Institute, the Jones Act was a law passed in the United States in the early 20th century, which restricts commerce between American ports to American ships. So if you have cargo you want to take from one American port and you want to sail it to another American port, you can only do that with a ship that is registered in the United States. And that's done in order to ensure that there's always a market for American shipping so that the United States always has a reserve, if you will, of American-owned cargo ships. So if there's a war and the United States Navy, or the government in general, needs access to cargo capacity, they'll have it available in the form of the cargo ships that are servicing trade between American ports. And that's a monopoly basically granted by the Jones Act and protected by the Jones Act. And it's more of a national security argument, and technically that does have some merit. But it comes with some pretty extensive economic consequences. And the Cato Institute in particular doesn't like those, and they like to write about them a lot. The Cato Institute has how should I put this? It has a preference, shall we say, for smaller government. And that's putting it mildly. So they don't really like examples of federal overreach, or, well, they do like them in so much as they get to write about them, which they do a lot. So in the case of the Jones Act, that's sort of the Cato Institute's poster boy for bad government overreach that distorts markets in a negative way. And if you want an idea of how the Jones Act distorts markets, you can look at Puerto Rico, where goods and services, mostly goods, are more expensive than they would be otherwise because the monopoly, well, the de facto monopoly granted on shipping between American ports extends to Puerto Rico. And that means that stuff carried on those ships is more expensive than it would be otherwise. This also impacts people in Hawaii, since they receive just about everything by ship, because it's such a small island. They can't really produce everything they need. But because they can only be served by Jones Act shipping, at least if they're getting cargo from the continental US, that means that stuff is just more expensive, which of course is just generally bad for everybody. It's also created some weird distortions as far as oil markets. People in California, well, I should say that oil consumers, shall we say, in California could buy their oil from Texas or the Northeast, in so much as they can't produce enough of their own. But what happens instead is that they'll actually buy it from Nigeria, and they'll have it shipped from Nigeria across the ocean and into California. And the reason they do that is because it's actually cheaper to use international shipping to ship that oil than it is to use Jones Act protected shipping, which has much higher rates. So if you got rid of the Jones Act, oil would actually be cheaper in places like California and probably also the northeastern United States, because then they could just ship it from places like Texas and other parts of the US, along the coast anyway, that have big surpluses in oil production, certainly surpluses in refinery capacity. And they can't do that now. Just because the Jones Act ensures rates are artificially high between ports, it's just cheaper to buy it from literally across the ocean. So that's another market distortion created by the Jones Act.
Are we selling stuff to other countries? Selling oil?
Yes, I believe so.
And we
do
purchase oil
export.
from other countries. It seems like just from an engineering perspective, it would make more sense to use the stuff that we have first.
It would, but just because shipping is more expensive and because pipeline capacity is finite, uh, the economics of it work out that it's cheaper to import from other countries.
That's insane. Because like moving such heavy material so far, that's a major operation.
Yeah, well, that's the Cato Institute's point. That's why they argue against the Jones Act, or at
Man.
least it's one of the reasons.
When was the Jones Act?
I think it was like 1920s, 1930s, something around there. It's been around a long time. But yeah, that was the Jones Act is the bête noire of the Cato Institute, so I hear about them a lot on my Twitter feed. Anyway, I'm not sure entirely how I got onto that.
We were talking about the NGO that gives women's health services in international waters. And
Oh
then we
yeah,
started
yeah,
talking about boats.
yeah, boats, right, right. That's how we got onto it. Well, I guess I'll just move on. I think we kind of covered that. I don't want to get too far into the tangents here. There's still plenty more to go. Let's see.
He doesn't want
Firms
to get
covering.
lost at sea here.
Yeah, yeah. I do that plenty enough already. So I mentioned before that firms are going to offer to cover travel costs. Pro-life states could come after that. They could try to make that illegal or tax it or something to that effect. So those firms, in turn, if that happens, could retaliate by trying to find legal loopholes by which they can still do it, but get around restrictions. American corporations are very good at finding loopholes. So my money is on the corporations if there's a battle on that one. Let's see. I already talked about Uber and whatnot. Oh, this is a weird one. This is a super weird one. So there's questions about what the federal government could do. Like I mentioned before, the government regulates interstate commerce. So hypothetically, they could try to ban abortion. Well, they could try to put a ban on people traveling across state lines to get an abortion, or maybe to provide an abortion, or some other sort of esoteric part of the supply chain or something like that. But that could be unconstitutional too. That's going to be a whole thing unto itself. But something else that could happen is that the federal government could allow abortion providers to set up on federal land, which is apparently a thing they could do. This is something that I've seen kind of rolling around the internet on social media recently as something the Biden administration could do in order to be proactive, something more proactive than, say, singing "God Bless America" on the Capitol Hill. Did you see that?
I did not.
Yeah, after the Dobbs ruling was announced, there was a bunch of Democrats in Congress who, they were publicly very upset. Of course, they had to kind of convey the discontent and outrage of their constituents. And after they said some, harsh words, they went out onto the steps of the Capitol building and they sang "God Bless America." And man, social media did not like that. The general attitude was, "What the fuck are you doing? There's so many things you can do. Why is this the choice? Why is this the move?"
Yeah.
Yeah, people are not, it's not just that Democrats are mad at the Supreme Court and the loss of constitutional protections for abortion rights. There's also a lot of bubbling and long running discontent with their own representatives who they feel have kind of let them down in so much as their inability to do more to protect abortion contributed to this happening. So that's causing political waves in and of itself. It's not just tension between Republicans and Democrats we have to look forward to. It's tension within the political parties. In the case of the Democrats, they're upset the Democrats weren't able to protect abortion rights, and they're going to be more upset with them in the future as they do stupid shit. And I don't doubt they're going to do a lot more stupid shit, like singing "God Bless America" in response to one of the most important rulings in American legal history. So the Republicans, for their part, are going to be fighting with each other because there's going to be a lot of argumentation about the extent that states should go to enforce abortion laws, and also the extent to which states should go to provide services for families. I was actually reading a CS Monitor article today about how there's tension within the party about increasing public welfare spending, specifically for families and mothers. The idea being that, with abortion ban, there's going to be more mothers, so we should ensure that those mothers have public support so that they can have enough resources to raise healthy, well-adjusted children. And there's some skepticism. Actually, it wasn't a CS Monitor article. It was an Atlantic article. That's what it was. But there's skepticism. There's a lot of skepticism that the GOP is actually going to do that. It seems instead, the prediction anyway, is that the GOP is more likely to just focus on further restrictions on abortion and fighting a lot of the legal battles that I've been talking about that are going to happen. So that's probably going to be more the impetus rather than adjusting welfare policies to kind of meet the new demand that's going to arise. But yeah, abortion services on federal land is one of the proposals for the government to try to be proactive in response to this. It's a super weird argument. I don't even know if that's legal, but it's the kind of weird legal bullshit that is going to happen a lot in response to this. There's going to be a lot of legal loopholes that people try to find at the local, state, and federal level. So if you see, say, Planned Parenthood setting up on federal land in the middle of the desert in Nevada, this is going to be why. Let's see, something else the federal government could do. They could try to make family planning and other costs associated with similar activities tax deductible or even tax refundable. So in that sense, there would be an implicit subsidy, which would be a super partisan move and would exacerbate tensions. But since that's apparently the theme of the decade, that seems likely to at least be attempted at this point.
On today's episode of Super Partisan Moves.
Yeah. And also a third option here, and this kind of ties into the proposal to have abortion services on federal lands. Can Native American reservations set up abortion services? Because technically they can already set up casinos. Even in states that ban gambling, you can still go to gamble on Native American reservations that are still in the same state. So could Native American reservations legalize abortion and provide abortion services? Again, we're moving into super weird times. This is going to be very awkward. And, if they do this, and assuming it's legal, it's going to create a lot of tension between the states that reservations are in, and those reservations, as well as tension between those states and the federal government, since the federal government actually has more authority over reservations than states do. So that's another legal battle that we have to look forward to.
Yeah, so it's a domino effect of legal battles. I can see why you said it's a can of worms, because it's like they made one decision, which now means that a million other decisions need to be made across the country.
Yeah. And that doesn't even get into things like maybe localities in pro-choice states attempting to ban abortion after this. They could make the effort. I imagine there are state laws in pro-choice states that make it legal regardless, but those could be challenged. So that could also be a thing, depending on how those laws are written. And I've already talked about how, pro-choice pro-choice counties and cities in pro-life states are going to end up resisting to varying degrees. Let's see. Okay, and radicalism. So this was the last item as far as the pro-choice crowd and how they're going to respond. One is hacking. You can target the databases and networks of law enforcement agencies that are going to be enforcing abortion laws. There could be special task forces that are designated to do that. So if that's the case, you could figure out where their office is, where their servers are, and those could be attacked. And you could just, erase those databases or otherwise render them dysfunctional. There could also just be hacking in general of law enforcement agencies in order to just inhibit their activity, or just to fuck with them. Hackers do that too. So that's hacking and cyber activism, as it used to be called. That's something that could happen. There's also going to be, and this is kind of skipping ahead a bit, but one of the things that the pro-life crowd is going to do is that they're going to try to send NGOs and activists and other just private citizens to try to infiltrate. And this is going to happen too. This isn't me being, hyperbolic. Activists, pro-life activists, are going to try to infiltrate underground networks of abortion providers, and they're going to try to inform on them. So that raises the question of, what do you do if you are such an underground network and you know that there are people who are trying to infiltrate the organization? So presumably then there are steps that are going to be taken to ensure their safety, the safety of members, the safety of women trying to get abortions, etc. So that means there's going to be a lot of measures taken to ensure anonymity. There's going to be steps taken that would be familiar to insurgents in Iraq, basically, to ensure that networks are decentralized and that are hard to trace. So the point I want to make here is that radicals then are going to retaliate against informers. If you do find out that somebody is an informer, or you think that somebody might be an informer and is potentially putting the lives of women in your network at risk, what do you do about it? Well, one thing you can do is just cut off contact with that person. That would be the nice way to do it. But there's also ways that you can send a signal. And radicals are not really known for their aversion to violence. So you can probably guess what some of those incidents are going to look like. So that's going to happen. There's going to be a tit-for-tat battle in the black market, not even the gray market, but the black market, wherein people try to infiltrate each other's networks. And it's not just going to be pro-life people infiltrating provider networks. It's going to be pro-choice people trying to find the networks of pro-life people doing the infiltrating and try to infiltrate them. Now, all of that sounds very spy versus spy, but there are definitely ideologues on both sides who are willing to go to this extent. And it's not even all that unprecedented. So that's going to happen. And there's going to be laws about that, too, regulating the degree to which you can preserve anonymity. If you're a pro-life state, then why would you allow networks like this to preserve anonymity using anonymity laws? Well, you could just water down the anonymity laws. In contrast, you could also water down the ability in pro-choice states. They could water down the ability of people. They could also water down anonymity laws so that it's harder for pro-life groups to do these kinds of infiltration tactics. So there's going to be impetus sort of amongst private citizens to basically fuck with each other in so much as they're trying to evade abortion laws, and then there's going to be pressure to pass laws to help or hinder one or the other of such groups. Also, there could be some tit for tat as far as protesting. Historically, in pro-life states in particular, there's been a lot of protests around abortion providers, Planned Parenthood and other such health centers. So it could be that there's a tit for tat where now going forward, there's a lot of protesters targeting pregnancy resource centers, which is a type of NGO that sets up centers that provide pro-life prenatal assistance to women who are pregnant. So those could be picketed and protested. I don't know that the pro-choice crowd would do that. I don't think they've ever done it, to my knowledge, but it could be that radicals cite that as a way to apply pressure and to retaliate against the pro-life crowd. It's a stupid way to do politics, but again, it's the 2020s, so quite fashionable, I imagine.
We live in stupid times.
Yeah. So let's see. So these are all things that the pro-choice crowd could do, and some of the things that the pro-life crowd will do in retaliation. I kind of implicitly covered a lot of the things the pro-life crowd would do. I guess some of the things I didn't cover, pro-life states, if not localities, are going to try to ban abortifacients. It's not guaranteed they'll try, but I'm betting that they will at this point. That seems to be the general direction. So they'll probably try to ban abortifacient. If you don't know what an abortifacient is, that's any kind of like pill or pharmaceutical or whatever that can induce an abortion. So they're going to restrict those or put a lot of legal barriers in place to getting them, or just ban them outright. They're also going to, I suspect, regulate the ability of medical professionals in general to share information about abortions. I kind of mentioned that earlier when I was talking about how family planning institutions could still operate, but they would have to just focus on sharing information. That information can go right up to the line to providing information about who provides abortions, where they are, how much it costs, and here's some money to help get there, etc. They can skirt the law in that sense. So states like Texas are probably going to go after that to some degree. Already talked about the accreditation of foreign doctors. That'll probably be a thing. Payment processing is an interesting one I was thinking about today. The U.S. sanctions regime that the U.S. has at targeting various countries doesn't just target the trade of specific goods and services. It also restricts the ability of firms, both inside and outside the United States, to use payment processing institutions, from using banks that provide payment processing services. So one thing you could do, hypothetically, is to restrict the ability of banks to provide payment processing for payments regarding abortions. Again, constitutionally and legally ambiguous, but it's the kind of thing that the pending abortion battle is probably going to lead us to. So that's another thing. There's probably going to be abortion-related regulations of the financial sector in pro-life states. Let's see, enforcement. Yeah, that was something I didn't talk about. So there's going to be a question of the degree to which pro-life states actually enforce these laws. So you could just have enforcement depend on informers. Not even just the kind that I was talking about before, like the dedicated ideologues infiltrating networks. It could just be like a family member knows that their cousin got an abortion, and then they just inform on the doctor, and then they have the state find out about it that way. But they could go a step further and have have actual surveillance. They could have an actual intelligence agency dedicated to surveilling people and ensuring that they're not engaging in behavior that abets or provides abortions. And that could be popular with the pro-life crowd, but it's also going to run counter to the preferences for small government among some people on the right. So there could be a mini civil war there within the GOP over that. But that's going to be a question. You could do that, and that would help assist in the enforcement of the law. And the argument in favor of that is going to be that we need to enforce the law. If we're going to pass a law banning abortions, we need to make sure that that law is obeyed and respected, and that people who break it are punished and caught. And if that requires a surveillance network of some kind, then so be it. So that could be something that the pro-life states set up. And they could even cooperate with each other, across state lines. That's something else that could happen. Let's see, we already talked about some federal options, networks of informers, targeting NGOs. Oh, and they're going to continue targeting abortion providers in the pro-choice states. So all of the protests that had been targeting abortion providers in red states, those could shift gears and focus on abortion providers in blue states. So that could result in some sort of reverse 1960s freedom riders shit. You could have anti-abortion activists getting on buses and being driven to abortion clinics in pro-choice states and doing picketing there, which will be interesting because I'm sure there will be a pretty strong response from the pro-choice crowd in those states. So that's something else to look forward to. So this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, and some of this stuff may already be covered by existing laws or may even already be prohibited by existing laws. So some of it is going to be decided law. But the point of creating this list was more to just illustrate the complexity of the legal battles that are going to play out now. It's not a settled issue like it was before. Well, settled legally like it was before, where it was constitutionally protected. So the big question was, should we continue to protect abortion, or should we not? Now that question has been answered, and has now fractured into a whole shit ton of different related peripheral questions, all of which are going to have their own pitched legal battles in individual localities, states, and at the federal level. And unfucking that is going to take 10 years at least, probably longer. And it's going to catalyze a significant amount of ideological partisan bullshit in American politics. It's going to take up a lot of political bandwidth. And it is all but going to reignite the culture wars, in so much as they hadn't already been reignited, and basically turn us back to the 1960s in terms of culture war bullshit.
And unfucking then would be a legal term.
Well, maybe not a legal term per se, but I think everybody knows what I mean.
Yes.
So yeah, that's why, hopefully I've kind of illustrated here why I was saying at the beginning that this is going to be a shit show. This is just going to be a big mess, and it is not going to resolve easily, and it is probably not going to resolve to anybody's satisfaction in the near to medium term, and maybe not even in the long term, depending on whether or not U.S. political institutions can recover. So again, let me underline here, I'm not saying that abortion is good or bad. I'm not criticizing the Supreme Court for overturning Roe v. Wade per se. What I'm doing is looking at the situation from an institutional perspective. I would not criticize the Supreme Court for overturning Roe v. Wade. Again, the ruling is technically sound. I would criticize the way in which they did it, which is part of a pattern of institutional decay in the United States. And in that sense, I don't like that. That's the concern for me. And the other concern being the culture war, which I hate. You can probably tell if you've been listening to this segment for long enough. I'm not a fan of culture wars. I think they're stupid. I think they're a distraction from real substantive issues. In general, I don't talk about them at all. But I live in the 2020s, and I can't avoid it anymore. Like, you guys, and when I say you guys, I just mean society general have just foisted it on me.
You rascals.
So, yeah, this is a thing, and this is as impartial an analysis as I can give on it. This is just what's going to happen, not necessarily what I want to happen or don't want to happen. The thing I don't want to happen is for U.S. politics to be rendered dysfunctional and to basically devolve into the politics of a banana republic. It doesn't necessarily matter to me if we end up with a pro-choice set of laws or a pro-life set of laws. What matters is the overarching health of U.S. political institutions, and culture wars are not good for the health of anybody's political institutions, and the general downward trajectory of U.S. institutions like the Supreme Court, certainly, or the legislature and the presidency, all of that bodes ill well for the long-term health of the country in general. So don't get me wrong, I'm not being partisan on here saying get an abortion today or don't get an abortion ever. I'm just critiquing the ruling from an institutional perspective. That's what I'm trying to do. Maybe I'm not entirely successful, but that's the effort I'm making, because I think that's more useful to people who are trying to look at this and learn about this than just, screeching about how wrong it is or right it is or what have you. If you want that, you can find plenty of other people who do it way better than I ever could. So yeah, that's my reading on the Dobbs ruling. That's what I have. Hopefully useful to somebody.
Thank you for helping break down a very sensitive issue in these trying times. We live in stupid times, Agent Smith.
Yeah. But, I can complain about it, but, I have to put my money where my mouth is. What do you do about it? Like, what is the solution? What is the proactive solution? And, the answer is that people have to mobilize, and they have to make clear what their stance is. They have to make clear what kind of society they want, and they have to make clear that they are willing to be active in fighting for that. Not violently. Don't start a civil war. As bad as things are, a civil war is going to be so much worse. Like, you have no idea. That's a Trumpian. You have no idea. Don't do that.
Yeah, the civil war that we had wasn't super great.
Yeah. If we had another one, it would probably just make us look like Colombia in the mid 20th century. Colombia had politics that looked surprisingly similar to US politics before the 1950s. I talked a little bit about that in that podcast series I did when I was talking about Colombia. So you can see how Colombia went from sort of politics that were more similar to the US and then devolved into violence, la violencia, and later on the Civil War. And the US, I could easily see moving along a similar trajectory. So if you want to look at what an American second Civil War would look like, take a look at Colombia, take a look at political violence in Colombia in the 1940s and 50s specifically. Stuff after that, probably not so much. We don't really have any jungle for insurgents to set up in, so that we don't really have that in common. But the way the violence played out in the 40s and 50s, I could definitely see that in the United States. So that's definitely an example of what political violence in the United States could look like, and is definitely a cautionary tale for what we should be trying to avoid. So don't do that, but that doesn't mean you can't be active and proactive in trying to push for your vision of America. And then, having done that, or at the same time that you're doing that, make clear that you have a political preference for stable political institutions, impartial institutions, rule of law, and political pluralism, and an independent judiciary, and all of the other good stuff that we would normally associate with Enlightenment liberalism. And for those of you who don't know what Enlightenment liberalism is, I always have to define this, because there's always one guy who says liberalism, oh, you're just some commie. No, not that kind of liberalism. Enlightenment liberalism refers to the values on which Western civilization was built in the Enlightenment period, starting in the 1400s onwards. So these are just ideals like having open government, small government, constitutional rule as opposed to rule of man. Some would argue economic freedom, although that's some people don't like that, but that's part of it. You have relatively open markets. So all of that, having a relatively small and prescribed government, that's a part of Enlightenment liberalism. And having solid institutions and rule of law, that's a part of Enlightenment liberalism. So in that sense, virtually everybody in the United States is liberal, or at least has been, historically speaking, because everybody kind of wants that. What?
Don't tell them that. It'll make them mad.
Yeah, well, it's true. It's true. Pretty much everybody. And it's just different varying degrees of liberalism that kind of define the American political spectrum. So that's what I'm talking about when I say Enlightenment liberalism. So everybody should learn about Enlightenment liberalism. I would argue people should be taught about it in high school so that they could at least learn the basic values, because they really don't teach that now. So learn those values and then show that you have a preference for those values. And so then tie those in with your own, political preferences on this, that, or the other hot button issue. So if you do both of those things, then you can reach a consensus, because a part of Enlightenment values is understanding that democracy is fragile. It requires forbearance. It requires concessions and negotiation. And then hopefully, ideally, once everybody is on that page, they can get onto the next page, which is consensus, which sounds like a utopian outcome, given how things are now. The idea of consensus seems so far away from where we are right now, it almost seems impossible. But that is the ideal, and that is the best way to ensure the continued health and survival of not only American political institutions, but just democratic institutions in general. So we need to work towards that. But we're not going to get there until we kind of get past this sort of hyper-partisan perspective where your opponents are not, how would you say it, loyal opposition, so to speak, as opposed to the literal devil, as I've seen some people portray them. So we need to get past that and recognize that we have fellow citizens in our country who disagree with us fundamentally on some important things that they feel strongly about, and that we need to create space for them in our legal system, in our constitution, in our society writ large, so that we can all live how we want to live without killing each other.
Right.
Or
basically, you're putting it in a very astute and robust way of saying people need to be able to agree on some shit. Or at least agree to disagree in a healthy way where both sides get some concession that makes them feel like they're heard and they have some amount of influence in the system.
Yeah. We need to recognize that negotiation and consensus is better, and in fact, the only sustainable outcome, as opposed to imposition of values, because that isn't going to work. I mean, if you're pro life, for example, did the passage of Roe v. Wade back in the 1960s destroy your opposition to abortion? No, of course not. No, of course not. You continued to fight, you continued to be active, and now you won. It took half a century, but you got there eventually. But the fact is, during that whole period, there was never a point when people on the right, at least most people on the right, were ever really okay with abortion. More conservatives in urban areas were okay with it, and I think a majority of the U.S. technically polls as being okay with abortion. But that's not the same thing as saying that they were approving of abortion. In general, there's been a lot of ethical and moral opposition to abortion all across the right side of the political spectrum, regardless of whether people on the right thought it should be legal or illegal. So that was always going to be a thing. But that doesn't mean that there's not room for concessions, not room for negotiations. Like, people on the left are not going to stop fighting now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned. So, I mean, what are we going to have? Are we going to have just like the law flipping, depending on who has more power in a given era? I mean, if you want to be cynical, you could argue that's how all politics works. But that's not really how politics is supposed to work, and it's not really how American politics worked up until recently. It wasn't really until after the Cold War, maybe in the mid 90s or so, that we switched to this mode of politics where we just switch from political parties and one political factions, political preferences and values in government, and then just throw them out and impose a new set of values when there's a new government. That may be in keeping with the passion and political preferences of voters, but it's a stupid way to run a country. Like, just explicitly.
You make exactly zero ground. I think if you're focusing on the politicized issues, and then every time you obtain power, you pull it in your direction, and then every time you lose power, it gets pulled in the opposite direction, the net result of that is like zero motion anywhere.
Yeah.
It's just
and it creates instability and unpredictability, because you never know who's going to be in office next and how dramatically the next set of changes is going to be. And the changes have been getting increasingly dramatic over time. The executive branch has been getting more powerful in U.S. politics over time, and that's increased the discretionary power that presidents have to swing politics in the other direction when they come into office. And that's not healthy, like, politically. It's not a good way to run things. It just creates a lot of instability, unpredictability that creates anxiety and knock-on effects, such as the delegitimization of the political system, which is also something we're seeing. The Supreme Court has already kind of brought its legitimacy into question just because of this. And I don't think that's entirely justified, given that the ruling was technically sound. But as an astute political observer will tell you, whether or not the government is doing something correctly or not does not correlate with its legitimacy. Legitimacy is very much a subjective thing. It rests on certain objective foundations, but by and large, it can change with the wind very easily. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's so much forbearance that's encouraged in institutions by traditional Enlightenment liberalism. Don't rock the boat too much, because even if it's a good idea to rock the boat, you may end up causing more problems than you end up solving, just because you end up pissing off so many people that they overthrow the government or undermine the government or otherwise just destroy the state's legitimacy to the point that it's rendered dysfunctional and ineffective. So Enlightenment liberalism, learn it, have that be your cornerstone, and then push hard within the contours of Enlightenment liberalism for the vision you have of the country you want. And then recognize that there are people who are passionate about life and about choice as far as abortion, and that there's also people who are passionate about different sides of a whole menagerie of other debates and whatnot. And recognizing that means that you try to create new institutions or adjust the ones you have, more likely, to try to fit that reality. You don't have to impose one set of ideals on each other. You can recognize that there are limits to what can be achieved, and that you should respect those limits and have institutions that are designed with that expectation and understanding in mind. So if you want to solve abortion tomorrow, you can't. That's the real answer. But from an institutional perspective, we already know that a lot of political preferences can be explained geographically. I was actually talking to one of our listeners about this. I won't say his name because I always generally prefer anonymity when I talk about people I talk to, but they know who they are. So I was talking and I was saying, part of the abortion debate is, a spatial phenomena. Like it breaks down that rural areas are very, very pro-life, and urban areas, especially metropolitan areas, are very, very pro-choice in general. You can find one or the other, and you can find pro-choice people in rural areas. You can find pro-life people in urban areas, but in general, that's how it breaks down. So if you know that, and people are passionate about it, then why not just have it be legal in metro areas and illegal in rural areas? Would that not make sense? Now, you can argue that abortion is murder and that it shouldn't be legal anywhere, regardless, but you have to recognize that that's a philosophical question and that there's half of the country or so that vehemently disagrees with that. And those people are not going to go away. And if you try to impose your view on them, it ends badly for everybody. It's not good for anybody. So yeah, it's hard to argue for murder. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to argue for political realism. There are limits to what a state should do and should be allowed to do. So if we could reach an understanding on that, and if we could reach an understanding on the other side too, as far as disallowing abortion in rural areas, I see no point to forcing it to be available, forcing rural polities, forcing rural counties to allow abortion. For one, they find ways to ban it anyway. I mean, for those who have been following the whole abortion debate in the United States, you'll note that the state of Mississippi was able, despite Roe v. Wade protecting abortion constitutionally, was able to restrict access and regulate the industry to the point where there was only one abortion clinic in the entire state, located in the capital of Jackson.
Yeah, so that's like the technical state of the law versus the actual implementation and what the state of affairs is.
Yeah. So pro-life areas have always been able to restrict access to the point where it was almost de facto banned anyway in a lot of those locations. So you can't really force abortion's availability in places like that. A lot of the people there don't want it anyway, and they got really mad over the past 50 years when people tried. So why not just let them ban it there and then let people in the metro areas have it? That just makes so much sense to me, and I don't understand why that's not acceptable.
Well, I would say not just for the abortion issue, but for a whole bunch of issues, there's really, really often a urban-rural divide. And I think a lot of people miss that format as such a key part of how human opinion and ideology forms. Is your opinions tend to be similar to those people who you surround yourself with. I think a lot of times people put maybe a little bit too much stock in their own ability to reason through the issue for themselves. Most people kind of start with a position on something and they stick with it, because if they change their position, they admit that they're wrong. I was actually talking about this on stream before we started Agent Smith today, but like being stuck with some perspective, you want to basically keep to that, like you've invested that time. And anytime you change your perspective, you admit that you're wrong, and that's a really scary situation for a lot of people, because they kind of see that as admitting defeat, and defeat doesn't feel great unless you have the perspective of someone like Kukio, or someone who has that kind of whimsical mad scientist vibe to them, where they just want to know the truth. They want to pursue truth, and if they're wrong on something, like Agent Smith says, they want to know more than anybody. That can be a really liberating thing if you can just kind of focus on that of, all right, this is what I was initially told, but since there are two really intense sides of the debate, they can't both be right. So one of them must be right, and everyone must start from some position. I think it can be really useful if you find some examples in your own life where you're proven wrong on something and you change your perspective. That basically means that you're not continuously wrong on that same issue for the rest of your life. So you're now dramatically more correct for the rest of your days, which I think could be a big win. But a lot of people, they just want to turtle up and say, nope, you can't make me move from this. Give me some confirmation bias instead, please. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, people are pretty stubborn like that. But that itself is just a reality of politics. That's just something you have to expect. I don't expect people necessarily to change their minds about how they feel about abortion one way or the other. I just hope people that see that the big picture, that everybody is like that, or at least the majority of people are like that. And that if you're going to govern a country filled with people like that, you need to have institutions that are designed with the expectation that there's going to be passionate people on both sides of issues and respects that, rather than trying to impose a final solution that engineers a society of a particular vision. That doesn't work, like flat out. Social engineering is not really a thing. Like nobody's ever really done it successfully. At most maybe you could find some partial successes, but no, it's just not really done. But that doesn't stop ideologues from trying. They just seem to have total faith that if they can go hard enough for long enough, then eventually they can proselytize the broader part of their opponents. And it doesn't matter how much they fail, they just assume that it's a matter of perseverance. So I guess as an addendum here, it's for those of you outside the United States who are perhaps more than a little bit mystified by events of the past week, I would point out here, just as part of some cultural commentary, as far as US culture, and this kind of extrapolates beyond the US too, there is not a single Anglo-Saxon country on the planet, the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, not one of them has a healthy relationship with sex. Because Anglo-Saxon culture, rather, has never had a healthy relationship with sex. It has always been this just weird issue, just weird thorn in the cultural side of Anglo-Saxon societies. Like it's sinful, but it's also just inevitable. It's like natural, right? You expect it. Other cultures know to expect it, and they just work around that. Like even in the Middle East, where women are not treated particularly well in most societies, even in those societies, sex is expected, and they don't really penalize it. And they certainly don't render it taboo in the same way that Anglo-Saxon culture does. In the Middle East, they have lots of restrictions regarding sex, but it's also normal that men have sex maybe outside of their marriage. They would not call it extramarital sex. They have these little religious loopholes that they engage in. But that's normal. Like it's just sort of expected behavior. And you can see that even in a lot of Catholic societies, like the Philippines. There are lots of restrictions regarding abortion and whatnot in the Philippines. But there's also a really hardcore machismo culture there, where men are kind of respected if they can have a lot of women and have a lot of sex. That's just sort of normal. But in Anglo-Saxon culture, just sex at all just makes people very weird and uncomfortable. Like, we really just don't like it here. It's so taboo that we turned it into a fetish. It's no accident that the United States produces more porn than the entire rest of the world combined. Like, that's not just a matter of the free market and the US having very laissez-faire approaches to regulating the production of pornography. It also just has to do with the fact that sex has this weird place in US culture and in Anglo-Saxon culture generally. You can argue that the UK and Australia, for example, are more open about sex. That's true to a degree, but they're still not nearly as open as, say, continental Europe, or certainly in other places, where there's kind of more of a positive perception of sex, or at least where expectations are more realistic. Anglo-Saxon societies just haven't really been able to quite square that. And so we kind of have this weird situation where maybe not the most developed anymore, but certainly the largest economy in the world, the nation with the largest economy in the world, and with some of the most modern political institutions, gets hung up on sex. And the abortion debate is very much related to that debate. You could even go so far as to argue that it's entirely predicated on that debate. You kind of start us off with the philosophical perspectives about abortion, like when life begins. Does it begin at conception? Does it begin at birth? What are the implications of one or the other? But it's not, it hasn't historically been a big part of the debate, really. It was really more about sex and the sexual revolution in the mid 20th century. That's really more where this came out of. The idea that women would be able to have sex without the potential risk and punishment, if you want to call it that, of pregnancy. I don't think people in a lot of societies have ever been able to handle that. And Anglo-Saxon culture in particular has been really squirrely about that. Like there are countries in Europe where there are abortion bans. There are, well, not bans, but restrictions. France, Italy, etc. I think they have like circa 20-week restrictions, on abortion. You can't get them past a certain time. In some cases, more restrictive than some of the abortion laws in the United States. But at the same time, abortion was much more readily available. So this balance between sexual freedom and sexual responsibility seems to have been struck pretty successfully in a lot of Europe. But we seem incapable of that here in the United States. Like there's just this resistance to it. There's this moral absolutism on one side or the other that just prevents any kind of reconciliation or consensus. And so the idea of sexual freedom itself has become this running debate. And you can kind of see that in the commentary. Like I've been listening and watching interviews with people, people who are pro-choice and people who are pro-life. And I've kind of noticed, and I've pointed it out to some people I've talked to, that a lot of the pro-life people, when they talk about their views, don't talk that much about the philosophy of when life begins. Like, does life begins at conception? They tend to talk a lot more about women who use abortion as a contraception or abortion as convenience. I've seen that come up very frequently in interviews to the point where it really doesn't seem like the philosophy and religious aspect of abortion is nearly as important as the sexual side of abortion and the cultural side of abortion. And that ties into the culture wars that started up in the 1960s, which I feel is really more the genesis of the abortion debate in the United States, rather than sort of some of the more modern interpretations. I think a lot of the abortion debate abstracted away from the origins of the debate, which again I think was centered more around sexuality, to the point where the pro-life people argued about life beginning at conception and having support for women and et cetera, all this sort of opposition to abortion that was nominally predicated on women's health. That was more where their position abstracted to. And then on the pro-choice side, it also abstracted to women's health. Which is better for the women's health, to have more access to abortions or less? And they argued more access because then you don't have as many restrictions, and women who need them can get them more readily.
Well, I think there's another major topic here, which is women's control over their own bodies, because pregnancy is something that occurs within a woman's body, and the processes that are happening have a major impact on her health and her survival, and also what the rest of her life is going to be. If she gives birth to a child, that is something that is very much tied to her emotionally speaking, genetically speaking, and then we assume guardianship is typically going to go to that person unless they put the child up for adoption. But for one, pregnancy is maybe the most painful thing that humans endure on a regular basis. I haven't been through that, but that's the word on the street. So I think evaluating if that's something that you want to go through as a woman, that's totally fair, and that's your choice to make. And then the other thing too is you have a lot of potential health complications that can occur through pregnancy. Like some women die in pregnancy because of these complications, and there are those really tough calls of, do you carry it to term so the child can live, or do you live? And those questions are so difficult to make that I feel like you can't just have a broad sort of rule that just says, well, we can make all these decisions for you. A lot of those are really unique to that person's situation, I think. And as a man who is single, I'm like pretty far from that being something that I need to concern myself with. So I try not to insert my opinion too much on it. But I certainly empathize with the position that you want control over what happens in your own body. And if something dramatic is changing, maybe you made a mistake before, that kind of a thing, having some say would be empowering, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree that that is sort of the bodily autonomy argument from the pro-choice perspective.
Yeah.
And, there's merit to that. But of course, the inevitable, counter argument is going to be that the baby or fetus or embryo or however people want to frame that, people debate about that too. But you know what I mean? Like the baby itself can be argued to also have rights, and those rights also need to be protected as per the pro-life perspective.
Yeah,
So
there's
how do you square those?
the thing you're talking about with our aversion to talking about sexuality. It ends up creating a nasty domino effect where we don't teach kids about safe sex practices, STIs, things like this in a very robust way, or even things like marriage planning, planning a child, that kind of stuff. So people just grow up and they kind of get put in these situations, and it's pretty tough for them to take the most optimal way forward because they haven't really gotten the correct education on it, because they'll say stuff like, well, that's stuff that your parents should teach you. Some parents do, and I would say my parents did a good job of just teaching me about the birds and the bees in a way that wasn't really weird, and it was helpful for me, and I kind of had a sense of what the human side of sexuality was and what to watch out for and that kind of a thing. It was a Christian perspective where their opinion is that it's sexuality is best between married people and that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But some people get basically no education about it. So I feel like it's very punishing for people who haven't received good sex ed to get into these sexual situations, jokes aside, and not really know what to do. And that's more of a systematic problem that we have. So any change that we make to the healthcare that's provided to people for this, there should also be like a very heavy investment in improving education in just what your options are, what the upsides and the downsides of the options are, so you can make informed decisions. Yes, kids are going to giggle if you teach them in school about sex stuff, but that's fine.
Yeah. Sex ed is an important part of the equation here, certainly.
Out of curiosity for people in chat and in YouTube comments and stuff, what sexual education did you get through school? Because I think for me, I was in Texas for middle school, elementary school, high school, not in that order. But we had like one day where you would go to one class and there were some slides of like a penis and a vagina, and it was like the very bare minimum of this is the anatomy. Okay. Also, if you don't want to get pregnant, don't have sex. Okay. Great. We're done. All right. Okay, well, we're going to talk about this in the cafeteria for a little bit, but that was basically the extent of it. And I ended up taking a human sexuality course in university, which was a lot more thorough than that. But that's pretty far into the educational track. Like, I don't think you should be waiting until people are 18 plus to even talk about sexuality, because teens are going to try stuff as they're growing up, just with people in their own age range. So you should be giving them the knowledge they need to not make big mistakes and such.
I don't really recall ever getting much. Pretty, I don't know, it wasn't particularly bad, but it wasn't like great either. It was just sort of standard textbook stuff in a health class in high school. Yeah, just, I guess basically it doesn't matter if a school provides good or bad sex ed. Well, I guess it doesn't matter what kind of sex ed a school provides if it provides slipshod, mediocre education to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a school like that, it's kind of a moot point, regardless, because most of the kids probably aren't paying attention anyway, and the ones that are aren't going to learn much. Given the state of a lot of schools in the United States, I suspect that's the more common variety of sex ed. But yeah, I brought up the cultural side of that just to kind of try to get at some of the underlying drivers of the abortion debate in the United States. Just that there is kind of a cultural uncomfortability with sex, and that kind of feeds in to opposition to abortion. And as evidence of that, you can just look at how a lot of pro-life people talk about abortion. There was one guy I saw interviewed by the BBC, and they were asking him about what kinds of, who gets abortions, basically. What was his impression? And his impression is that a lot of them were just getting it out of convenience, basically that they were sleeping around and were being promiscuous and were using it as a form of contraception, which is not true. The data doesn't support that, but that seems to be the most common impression amongst people who are pro-life. And it comes up a lot. Again, that seems to be a common point, that babies should not have to die for convenience. That was another phrase that I saw used. So that's just another manifestation of cultural preferences there, and that kind of gets into the debate that's also emerged not only in the United States, but the broader developed world over the past 10 years between sort of the indigenous versus the cosmopolitan, I guess is one way to frame it. There's this sort of international metropolitan cosmopolitan culture that's emerged, or that has integrated with it, integrated across borders over time, which is sometimes at odds with some of the more rural traditional cultures in different countries, and sort of traditional values like sexual values or abortion, in so much as that's an extension of sexual values. Those are sort of one of the battleground issues on which those two factions clash. And so traditional values in the United States partly means an aversion to sexuality. And one of the ways that you can control that is by inhibiting access to abortions. So that's not really how most people would frame the abortion debate in the United States, but that's more my impression of what's driving it under the surface. Sort of the underlying cultural preferences that are driving the political preferences that we generally see more clearly.
Yeah, definitely not a one time to talk about issue. This may be a new sort of Brexit topic where one thing happens and then we have the 3-year follow-ups. Hey, do you have any update on Brexit? Do you have any update on... Oh, you do?
I actually do.
He has a Brexit update.
Yeah, it never went away. There's other news items we just haven't gotten to because they got crowded out because, 2020 vibes and all that. But yeah, the British government, the Johnson administration over in the UK, has been trying to basically challenge the European Union to a duel, in effect. And I suspect it's kind of a wag the dog situation. Instead of a war, being the catalyst, it's more trade tension or a trade war. So the British government seems to be trying to start one up so that they can use it to distract people. Because I don't really think the issues that they're predicating this proposed trade war on are really all that substantive. They seem like they would be pretty easy to solve with methods that are not nearly so confrontational as what the Johnson administration has been using. So the issue is the Irish border protocol, which you may remember we talked extensively about years and years ago, back when Brexit was a regular feature of this segment. The issue was, for those of you who did not follow this segment, or maybe who don't remember all of the Brexit stuff, one of the big sticking points in the negotiations over the United Kingdom leaving the European Union was whether or not there would be free trade across the Irish border. And the reason that was a sticking point is because free trade across the border between the UK and Ireland was a big part of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended violence between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, which was the culmination of a long period of political violence between the two communities that occurred starting in the mid-20th century. And, well, actually, it started way before that, but there was a wave of terrorism that started in the 1970s that instigated a lot of community violence, and that ended in the 90s with the Good Friday Agreement. And one of the tenets of the Good Friday Agreement, again, is that there would be free trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So preserving that peace deal was a major European Union objective. And the United Kingdom nominally also made it an objective, but it didn't really seem as important to them as preserving the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. And the reason that was an issue was that the European Union wanted to ensure that there was free trade across that Irish border, but it also didn't want British goods and services to freely cross that border, thereby circumventing the tariffs and regulations that would normally apply to countries exporting goods to the European Union from outside the Eurozone. So, how do you ensure that border stays open while also ensuring that the United Kingdom does not get an unfair advantage over other countries outside the European Union? And also taking advantage of the Eurozone without actually being a member of the European Union. So, it took a lot of negotiations and a lot of brinksmanship, but eventually they reached what was called the Irish Border Protocol. And basically, the idea is that people in Northern Ireland can export goods and services across that border freely, and people in Ireland can also do so. But Northern Ireland is de facto, as a result, separated from the rest of the United Kingdom, economically speaking. So the Northern Ireland gets to remain a part of the European Union economic area. You know, they can still trade within that without being subject to tariffs and whatnot. But in exchange, the United Kingdom had to set up border checks in ports, mostly in Western Britain, on goods, and so that goods and services going from the United Kingdom to Northern Ireland could be checked to ensure that they met European Union standards. So, in effect, the United Kingdom had to treat Northern Ireland like it was not inside the United Kingdom. So that was the agreement that was reached. It was very unpopular amongst the Brexiteers because they insisted that it was not constitutional, even though they don't have a constitution, but basically that it was not really legal, since they created what they called a border in the Irish Sea. And so that's been very controversial. People in Northern Ireland really don't like it, especially the Protestants in particular. And they've argued against it vociferously for ever since, ever since it was implemented. And the Johnson administration says that there's now enough evidence that the deal, the Irish Border Protocol, has been sufficiently disruptive to the economy and life in Northern Ireland that a provision in the agreement, which allows renegotiation in the case that the agreement's implementation becomes too disruptive, should be activated. Basically, he wants to activate that clause and renegotiate. And he's saying that if the European Union does not renegotiate, then he's going to unilaterally remove border checks from, stop border checks on goods and services going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And that would basically open up the European economy to British goods and services, since they would no longer be subject to border checks and whatnot. They would still be subject to border checks if they were going directly from Great Britain to Europe, but instead they could just route those goods through Northern Ireland and then across the open border with Ireland. So at that point, de facto, the UK would be in the European Union's free trade zone again. And since they're not a European Union member, they're not supposed to have that. So the European Union, seeing that threat, has basically retaliated by threatening this, that, or the other trade penalty, on goods and services coming from the United Kingdom in order to punish the UK and deter them from doing this. Now, all of this is pretty unnecessary. They could just negotiate quietly, out of, away from the news and journalists and whatnot, a new deal that kind of addresses some of the issues. And the European Union has already said that they would be willing to make concessions to deal with some of the disruptions that the deal's implementation has caused in Northern Ireland. So, for example, they've agreed to relax restrictions and border checks on food, for example, being exported from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. So that food is cheaper and more available. There's been some shortages there recently, not related to the kinds of shortages we've had outside of the area that kind of everywhere is seen, but more specifically related to the implementation of the deal. So things like that, the European Union has said they're willing to give ground on. But in spite of that fact, the UK has not said, okay, well, let's do some of that and then that'll ease the problem. Instead, the British government has tried to turn it into this sort of battle, this contest of wills between Brussels and London. And I suspect that they're framing it like that for political reasons. Again, if you really wanted to deal with the substance of the issue, you could do that without the drama. But the Johnson administration seems to want drama. In fact, given how they've performed over the past couple of years, they seem to revel in drama more than anything. But regardless, that is what's been happening recently. There could be a trade war between the European Union and the UK, but more likely the UK is just trying to milk the issue for headlines, and then we'll quietly renegotiate the deal, a month or two from now when people kind of forget about it. But yeah, Brexit is still an ongoing thing. It has not gone away. That is still part of the British and European landscape of politics.
It's kind of like this abortion issue in that, like, once the first domino falls, it's going to be another million decisions that need to be made. So, yeah.
So in that sense, Europe kind of shares some of our drama, so to speak,
Yeah.
that we've been experiencing here in the US. In Europe, it's rather less visceral. Well, I guess that's not true. The Ukraine war is pretty visceral. But the European Union, anyway, doesn't quite have the same kind. Well, I guess you could say Hungary. Some of the things Hungary and Poland have been doing. Yeah, I guess it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same. It's a different kind. They have a different set of issues that they're facing, but they're also similarly disruptive to the issues we have in the US. Yeah, it's like that everywhere. China has that now. Have you seen the beatings in China recently?
No?
Would you like to?
It sounds TOS. What is the...
Yeah, it's very TOS. Don't do that.
Why are they
But
doing
really,
that?
it's not the government doing it. So here's what happened. There was a restaurant in Tangshan, which is like a steelmaking city southeast of Beijing. And it's a pretty decent sized city. And there was a restaurant there, and there was a woman who went there, with some friends. And one of the guys there decided to kind of hit on her, and he actually kind of touched her, on the arm or whatever. And, that's harassment. And a lot of women really hate that, don't want to have to deal with it. So she doesn't want to start any shit, so she just kind of ignores him and pushes him away. Like, I don't want to deal with this. So how does the man respond? Well, I kind of foreshadowed that. Beating. He starts beating her. And then his friends come and start beating her. And then he and his friends start beating her friends who came with her. And all of this was recorded. It's all on camera. It was all on the security cameras in the restaurant. And of course, that footage made it online. And that's been one of the big talking points in China recently, especially for the past 2 weeks or so. And, by itself, maybe it's just an isolated incident, but it's not. Because if you know anything about Chinese culture, you know that Confucianism did not have a particularly high regard for women. So women in China historically have not had it particularly great, and that's not a problem that the communists were ever able to solve. So in this case, in particular, the government actually ended up looking bad, because the government's response to the violence was pretty weak-kneed. So the local government in particular basically came out and did nothing at first until it became an issue online, and then they had to do something. So they came out and said, oh, well, these guys were just local gangsters. And so then the question was, well, why didn't the local government do something about violent gangsters? So the assumption was that, well, like in the rest of China, like in a lot of places in China, probably the local politicians knew the local gangsters. In fact, probably they worked together. So there were a lot of accusations that the government was basically not protecting women, that it was in league with lawless criminals, gangsters, what have you, and that this is just yet another manifestation of not only corruption in China, but China's general disregard and mistreatment of its women. Mind you, this is not me criticizing China. This is not a foreign criticism of China. This is Chinese people, and especially Chinese women themselves. This is what they're arguing, and they're very, very upset about this. I have a friend in China who is a woman, and they've made this argument very viscerally. They're pretty angry about this. And this is not an isolated incident. There's been similar incidents like this recently. Not all of them have been beatings, but one of them was a woman who worked at Alibaba, which is a big tech company in China, was ordered, not asked, but ordered to go drinking with her boss and some of her coworkers. So that's pretty rude, but of course, you can't really say no to your boss, and especially in a hierarchical culture like China's. So she goes and she drinks, and she ends up passed out in a hotel room in which she wakes up with her pants around her legs.
Yikes.
So you can probably infer what happened. And she knows what happened too, because she asked the hotel for footage from their security camera, and guess who slipped into her hotel room multiple times during that night after she collapsed in her hotel room? It was her boss.
Oh.
So, Alibaba employee raped by her boss on a function not even relating to her job that she was forced to participate in. Now, some people were giving her shit for drinking at all, but if you know anything about drinking culture in places like China, that's not really voluntary. You kind of have to.
Yeah, I was reading as well in South Korea. It's expected that you go drinking with your colleagues after work, and they already
Yeah.
work like hellish long hours. So it's like they peer pressure you into it kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's you can see the same thing in Japan. There's a lot of peer pressure and a lot of implied social obligation to go drinking with your coworkers and in particular boss after work, and it's just something you kind of have to do, and you just sit through it even if you don't want to. So it's very similar in China. In fact, basically the same thing. So that was another bad case recently. And then, of course, there was the famous case in Suhzou, which I think was last year. I don't know if you remember this. I don't even remember if we talked about it. But there was a woman who was found by the police shackled in a shack out in the rural area around the city of Suhzou. And, they asked about it because that's weird. And what they found is that this woman had been forced to live with the man who was holding her captive for decades. She had been sold to this man as a basically trafficking victim, and then he kept her for decades and also had children by her. And when she got older, she started to get a little mentally unstable, and so rather than caring for her, he locked her up in a shack in his backyard. And this was really shocking. This was actually even more shocking a case to China than the incident I just talked about in Tangshan. Lots of women said, how can this happen? Like, this is the 21st century. How can you just lock a woman up like that and just hold her? And to a lot of Chinese women, this was just another example of how they're not really valued in Chinese society. So that was a really egregious case, and people were really pissed off about that. And then this Tangshan thing happened, and so now they're even more pissed off. And so now people are going out of their way to find all of these other examples in Chinese society of how women are disrespected, and it's become a thing. But the trouble is that there's not really much they can do about it. As my friend pointed out, who do you sue, right? We don't have rule of law here. Like, if the government doesn't want to do anything about this on its own, of its own accord, then nothing is going to get done. Like, we have no courts that we can go to. There's no lawsuits we can make. It's just totally out of our hands. So we just kind of get raped and murdered, and then the government doesn't do anything, and that's it. That's just life, which is upsetting for a lot of people. So yes, things are bad in the United States. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems in Europe, but there's a lot of problems everywhere. And China's no exception. And that's just one of the problems they have. That's not even necessarily the most dire one. But yeah, everybody is pissed off now. Everybody's upset, and I don't know how to fix it other than to say, hang in there and fight for what you believe in. So, in so much as that means anything, hang on to that, I guess.
Yeah, everyone is, I guess you could say every country, every region has their own pursuit of fairness, and you have different cultural norms and expectations for the types of personal liberties and protections that they deserve. And yeah, you could say that battle is being fought everywhere at some point in the, I could say the stages of development for society and civilization. There was a book that I was reading where it's talking about the surprising decline in violence over time, and how a lot of this is just based on people's norms that they feel about what is okay and what is not okay, where it's more about that feeling of what is barbaric and savage and what is backward and what is forward thinking, rather than reasoning through everything for themselves. That's a really energy intensive thing, to reason through an entire issue for yourself and then arrive at some conclusion.
Oh yeah.
Usually you're kind of navigating group situations, and you're kind of seeing who comes out with the strong opinion and which one feels correct to you. That could be based on appeals to emotion. It could be based on the logic behind it, but we are to some extent open to persuasion, and we can have different kinds of persuasion, but it does boil down to that feeling of, oh, this is just uncouth and it's gross now, instead of it's noble in some way. One of the examples that was given was the gentleman's duel, and how for a pretty long amount of time that was seen as a way to defend your honor, and something that in certain cases you might feel like should be done. But you fast forward hundreds of years to the point where the people who would go out to these duels were loose cannons and just brutes and not really respectable members of society. They were more so thugs. And that attitude shift ultimately is what shifts the law, where it says, okay, maybe this just is murder and it's illegal and we're going to not do this anymore. So for these issues that we're really fussing over and milling over right now, it's possible that we will end up finding some consensus later down the road once people's feelings about the issue have more overlap. Currently, they do not. So we're stuck in at a standstill for quite a few of these issues that are dominating the news cycle right now.
Unfortunately so.
Kind of wondering now, with like the lumps of time, we've talked about periods where skepticism is valued and moderation is valued and compromise, and then periods where conviction to one's beliefs are valued. And I'm thinking, are those like 3 decades and then you have a swing, or is it like a century long thing?
Well, to a degree, I mean, both in a sense. It kind of comes in gradations. So you can have periods where people are relatively more or less skeptical for a period of a couple decades, and then they slightly swing in one or the other direction. But then you also have these sort of larger macro trends, bigger cycles, wherein there's a broader shift culturally away or towards skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the two are not mutually exclusive in that sense. In the United States, you can kind of see how liberalism and illiberalism has waxed and waned over time. But if you look at Western civilization, you can see something similar happening. So in general, we've shifted more towards liberalism more recently. And you can see that too in like older civilizations where they had kind of more contemporary antecedents to liberalism, where they kind of went through for like maybe a century or two before shifting away again. So the West has kind of stuck with liberalism for longer, but that's partly because of technological and economic changes, probably interfering in what would be the normal evolution of ideals and politics and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know that we're entering a period of a super cycle where we're sort of shifting away as a civilization from skepticism and whatnot. I think it's too early to tell that. We probably won't know until after the fact anyway. By then it'll be too late, most likely. But yeah, certainly we're sort of in an era where skepticism is in a weird place. I mean, I can't even really say that people are less skeptical now. It's almost like we have skepticism on steroids now, to the point where it's harming trust in institutions. I mean, it's not that people have turned on liberalism per se, it's that their perception and interpretation of it has kind of mutated in a weird way.
No, I don't think we're hyper skeptical right now. I think we are taught to be hyper skeptical selectively of certain people, which I would argue is not true skepticism. True skepticism is being skeptical of the people you like and you agree with, and the people who you dislike and you disagree with, both of them kind of evenly, at least in a logical capacity. Usually people will suspend a lot of their skeptical cognitive faculties when they're listening to people who they know are already of their tribe. When their tribe is talking, they're nodding, they're saying, yep, this is what we need. They're kind of shaking their fist and feeling good about it. And then when they hear the opposite side talk, they're hyper aware and ready. So I would say that people have the capacity for skepticism, absolutely, but it's very much selective in who you point it toward.
I would agree. But if you look at something like flat earthers, right, well, partly that's just trolls, but there's also this hyper skepticism, like, okay, well, how can I trust anybody? How can I trust the educational system that they were telling the truth about the world not being flat? So, this is the kind of sort of hyperskepticism that I'm talking about. It's not so much people using skepticism to reify their pre-existing beliefs. It's more skepticism and mistrust of authorities. And that kind of lack of trust is partly what's driving and undermining institutions in the West over the past couple decades. So I don't disagree with you. You're right. That is definitely one of the ways skepticism is used. But hyperskepticism, as I'm defining it, has more to do with this other strand of hyperskepticism.
When you are skeptical of the entire scientific method and field and that whole domain, it could all be a sham.
Well, it's not so much the method that's the sham. It could be the academics that are the sham. I mean, how many academics do you know? How many have you met? Have you ever been to a university and actually seen the research they do? How do you know it's not all just bought and paid for? It's that
Because
kind of thinking.
because it's laborious and boring for most of it. That's why I trust in academia and in science, because it's very boring. I was told and warned. I went to university early and I got some books on the dangers of teaching about evolution. And you know, the real essence that swayed me in favor of believing in evolution by natural selection was because of how fucking boring and tedious taxonomy was. They're just organizing shit and they're looking at the overlap in the genetic material and they're saying this shit is probably related to this shit. And I'm like, I thought this was going to be devilish and sexy, and I'm woefully disappointed. I was ready to be tempted by the seductive science, but I was just challenged to stay awake. It's robust, and it seems to work overall, and you've got some people who are working really hard to try and advance it a little bit in some direction. Nevertheless, we persist. We are at 3 hours today, but there were a few questions if you want to rapid fire them, but if you want to rest, you can.
Oh, I'm doing fine. I've been staying up late. Who was it? I don't remember who it was, but I asked somebody for like a recommendation on a playthrough for Stellaris. And somebody said, try a civ that was authoritarian and what was it? The other, I think materialistic was the other one. So I actually did. And so I've actually been staying up late doing that the past week. So I'm good. I can go longer, but I don't want to hold you up. I know you've been up for, all day doing streaming, so I'm sure you're tired.
It's all good. We've just got 6 of them, some more specific, some more vague, and some silly ones.
Right. Let's see what we got here. Do I believe the nominees lied under oath to get into the Supreme Court? No, I actually don't. I know Reddit has been kind of obsessed with this. They keep, posting videos of Supreme Court justices, some of the conservative ones that were appointed the past few years, being interviewed during the nomination process. And they were asked, do you think that Roe v. Wade is settled law? And of course, they all said yes. And now they've obviously overturned the law. So some people are saying, okay, well, they lied. And actually, no, they did not lie. Saying that a law is settled law is not the same thing as saying that you think the original ruling was correct and you would overturn it. And you'll note that in a couple of cases, they were directly asked, would you overturn it? I think I remember seeing like one video where they were asked that. And they actually gave this really political, circuitous answer. They said, I would rule according to the law or something, very technical like that. So they kind of gave evasive answers, basically, but they never actually lied, which is not a surprise because they're lawyers. They know how to do that. It would be a surprise if they did lie. There's no need to do that. As a lawyer, you get lots of training on how to give circuitous, evasive answers, and Supreme Court justice nominees are no exception. So no, I don't think they lied. I have not seen or been shown any video as of yet in which they can be shown to be or proven to be explicitly lying. Evasive, yes, but that's pretty normal for the nomination process, so that doesn't surprise me either. Let's see. Do you think we will go into a recession? Probably. I think the old joke is that economists have predicted 6 of the last 3 recessions, something like that. So we're not particularly accurate about it. And especially now that we have an economy that has advanced and evolved so much and for which we have so little data, given that there hasn't been a lot of stimulus. Well, not stimulus, that's not the right word, but there's not a lot of interventions or big events that have caused distortions in the economy that we can study to see how it really works over the past 30 years. You know, we had the financial crisis '08, and then of course 2020 happened and we had the pandemic, and more recently we've had inflation, but that's all recent stuff. Like over much of the past couple decades, the economy has actually been fairly stable in the United States and the globe writ large. And while that's a good thing, it also means that there's not a lot of variation that we can study in order to understand what makes it change. And without that variation, it's kind of hard to make predictions. So I can't really tell you what the economy is going to do, but I take comfort in the fact that really no economist can do that. You know, there have been many who have tried, but the economy right now is just acting super erratic. Well, not even erratic. I can't even say it's erratic because erratic implies irrational, but actually, this could well just be normal economic activity given the way the economy is structured. But we just don't know that it's normal yet because we don't have the precedent and data. You know, we're in the process of getting data. Obviously, with the pandemic and all of the inflation and all that, you know, we're kind of seeing how the global economy acts under stress. So we're learning how it works now, but because we're still learning how it works, we can't really make predictions. You know, it's kind of like asking somebody who's doing the tutorial for a game how the game is. Like they can't really tell you; they haven't really started yet. They're still learning how to play. So economists are still learning how to play, so to speak, this economy, and so we can't really make predictions. And so that's why a lot of economists' predictions have been really inaccurate over the past couple of years and are probably going to continue being fairly inaccurate for the foreseeable future. So that said, probably. We'll probably have a recession. Given what we know about the economy, given that there's persistent inflation and that it pretty much is persistent at this point, given that there has been some tailing off of retail sales, I think some inventories have been building up. I don't know if the interest rate curve has inverted yet, but it probably will before too long, I would expect. But yeah, there are signals that a recession is probably on the horizon. If not this year, then next year, probably. I would guess. That's what I've been reading. But really, who the fuck knows? I mean, it's at this point, if it just took off and did really well and inflation went away and everything went back to normal, or if aliens came and just blew everything up, like almost anything is pretty much within the realm of possibility at this juncture, economically speaking. So, I mean, who knows? Best guess is yes, there's going to be a recession, but the likelihood and confidence that I or really any other economist can put in that prediction is middling at best, given the analytical limitations that we're facing as a profession right now.
Yeah, I would say a recession is guaranteed depending on the time frame. So the question more so is when, because
Yeah.
there's always going to be a boom and then a recession and then a boom and then a recession. That's part of the ebb and flow of it, based on different emerging markets, different major world events that happen, and we have plenty of world events that happen. And the reason that it's so hard to predict things in the economic sphere is because you're talking about multi-million dimensional spaces where if you want to have the accurate prediction, you need to account for millions, if not billions, of different variables. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. If you give me like a pool of water, let's say, well, not even that, let's say a bucket of water. And then you ask me, okay, nothing is happening. The water is still, nothing is interacting with the bucket. Predict what the water is going to do. It's not going to do anything. It's just going to be flat. So that's easy, right? So imagine if you stick something in the water, maybe something that vibrates or something. So you could say, okay, well, it's vibrating at such and such frequency. So it's going to make waves. There's going to be vibrations that reverberate through the water. So you're going to see some vibrations, and it's going to happen at such and such incidents based off of the frequency. So imagine if, I don't know, you throw a baseball bat into the bucket and then kick it over and then you light it on fire, all in quick succession, and then ask me, okay, what's the water going to do?
And
I have no idea.
And the pool is on a ship in the ocean, and it's storming outside.
There you go. Yeah. Like all of those factors together mean that I have to account for each of them in predicting what each individual droplet of water is going to do, and I can't. There's too many variables. The water is too unpredictable. Like it's too much, analytically speaking. So that's kind of what's happening to the global economy right now. We had a pandemic, and then the year after that, we had inflation start up and become persistent, and then the year after that, we had a big war in Europe. which is disrupting energy markets. So any one of those things would have effects on the economy that would be difficult to predict. And we have all three at the same time.
Yeah.
Good luck. It ain't happening.
You have
So
a
let's see.
silly one next.
If vegetables fought each other like Pokemon, what would be your starter vegetable and why? That is a very weird question.
See if Whiskey even puts some little shrug cat emojis of like, I don't know why this one is here, what to do with it, but I'm passing it along in good faith. That's the question person today.
I'll tell you what. Lettuce.
And why?
Lettuce is a wait, is lettuce a vegetable?
Yes.
That's a vegetable, right?
Yes.
Because that's the most similar to Bulbasaur.
Oh, nice. Good answer. Good answer.
Yeah, I'm a part of the small oppressed minority of Bulbasaur starters in Pokemon.
I'm also a Bulbasaur starter.
Oh yeah, Bulbasaur gang rise up.
That's why we're friends. There was a big fight in our university cafeteria. All the Bulbasaur people were getting picked on by the heckin' Charmander and Squirtle gang. Me and Agent Smith, we were duking it out. I'm trying to think of what my vegetable would be then. Potato is such a robust thing. I think it counts as a vegetable. It's nice and heavy. It seems like it would be a good projectile if it threw itself at someone. It's got a lot of calories and starches, and a lot of people like it. Potato is a good one.
Yeah, very robust, utilitarian.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, well, vegetable battles aside, I'm curious what Agent Smith thinks the political endgame is for both U.S. parties and all this nonsense. Oh, the parties are going to be fine. They love this because they can run on this. Culture wars are fantastic for political parties because it means they can be lazy. They don't actually have to do anything. They could just take a lot of symbolic actions, pass symbolic legislation that probably won't even survive Supreme Court review. They can just do whatever they want so long as they're perceived to be fighting the culture war. And this is another reason that culture wars are so insidious, because it's just really easy for politicians to distract the public with this kind of stuff while they actually govern, and generally in a way that you're not going to like when you find out about it, 5, 10 years later, when the consequences of their bullshit decisions come out. So I think the end game for both the parties in the United States is to just take advantage of it. Again, like I said earlier, this is basically the successful resurrection and resuscitation of the culture wars from the 1960s. And so they can just use that as fodder for as long as they need. It doesn't matter how bad things get. It doesn't matter if the economy implodes or if we get into wars. People are going to want to fight the culture war. And so they can just run on that. So no matter how badly they screw up actual substantive public policy, so long as they're on the right side of the culture war, they'll get reelected.
So what you're saying is this is the end game.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah, this is what they want. This is a good, safe, predictable environment if you're a politician.
I just thought of like the exact analogy of this that people might be able to relate to. This is when you're a kid in the class who doesn't actually have to do any studying for that particular class because the class clown got the teacher to go on a rant about something off topic. And you can just sit there and watch the argument and maybe throw in a comment here or there based on how you want to shift the situation, but you don't have to do homework. You don't have to do a test. You don't have to do a quiz. You don't have to do any of the tedious stuff that actually builds your knowledge in the class. You can just watch the fight and then give your hot take.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's how it works. So yeah, they'll be fine. It's the rest of us who are screwed now. Let's see. What is my opinion on Thomas's opinion that other rulings based on the 14th should be revisited? We kind of already talked about that earlier. He says that they should be revisited, and that is technically sound. Like, from the perspective of his legal philosophy, and legally speaking, that would technically be reasonable. That is grounded in established legal sort of philosophy and whatnot. So I'm not surprised that he wants to. I think it would have been better, ideally for Congress to have passed laws to try to either regular laws or constitutional amendments to protect this, that, or the other right. That would be the better way to do it legally if that is what you want to do. But that said, you know, again, I don't think it's technically wrong, but legally speaking, it would be better if the legislature kind of dipped in here and tried to just settle it once and for all. But like we said earlier, that's not going to happen. So it's probably just going to cause more problems. That is to say, ruling like this sort of approach to this approach to judicial review is going to just cause more problems than it solves.
Yeah, we talked before about how it's less about, well, there are different elements to why you would make a certain ruling or why you would change stuff, but you mentioned that if you have a broad and severe negative reaction to a certain ruling, usually they try to avoid that as well, just as a norm rather than a hard set rule. And this would be a clear disruption of that norm.
Yeah.
Because they know that they're going to piss off half the country, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah. If they'd done what Roberts wanted to do, it probably would not have been nearly as bad. It certainly wouldn't have been nearly as bad. But instead, they went kind of whole hog. Mm-hmm. I was listening to I guess it was a podcast or a BBC radio thing or something, and they were talking to a legal expert, about a constitutional lawyer, basically, about the ruling. And, she was saying that people were concerned about the Supreme Court going down a slippery slope, and instead they've dived right to the bottom of the slippery slope. So that seems to be the general trend here as far as rulings, at least this summer. Let's see. Fuzzy Cord. Q for I read that Protestant Christian groups didn't care one way or the other about abortion until 79, when the issue was used as a political wedge to prevent Jimmy Carter from getting reelected, with the hidden goal of preventing Carter from further desegregating schools. Was this author correct about the motivations behind the anti-abortion movement? See, this is what I get for being lazy, Nero, because I actually have an article open in one of my tabs talking about the history of abortion perspectives in the United States, and I haven't read it yet, so I actually can't answer this.
The answer is hidden in that article. Next week on World Discussion with Agent Smith, we are going to tackle this one.
Actually, you know what I can do? I can just post the article. So I may not be able to answer it. I should be able to, but what I can do in lieu of that is just send you a link.
He's going to make the chat do his homework. Yeah.
And I'm not logged in. So I'm going to send it to you, and I'll politely ask you to post it, if you might. Thank you very much.
One thing to note is that between the Protestant church and just way of thought and Catholic church, there's been a divide in terms of reproductive freedoms, namely birth control, and how birth control was something that, at least from my understanding, it was fine and normal for Protestant married couples to use birth control if they were not wanting to have kids at the present moment. But for Catholics, there was more discouraging of, if God chooses for you to have a child at this time, you should have the child. You shouldn't take contraceptives or use birth control, kind of a thing. This is the article in question. I just posted it in Twitch chat.
Well, thank you. Yeah, abortion was more of a Catholic thing. In fact, I mentioned before that there's a number of countries in Europe, in the developed part of Europe even, that have abortion laws that are more restrictive than the ones that we had in many parts of the United States before Roe v. Wade was overturned anyway. And what you'll note, though, is that most of those countries are actually Catholic. None of them are Protestant. It's like France, Spain, Italy, Poland, and a couple other Catholic countries, but Germany also. Germany is not exclusively Catholic, but I think it's something like 50-50 Catholic Protestant, so that still counts as well. So there's not really any Protestant parts of Europe that have these kinds of restrictive abortion rules in Europe. So yeah, it is definitely a Catholic thing. But it evolved during in the 1970s when it started to change, and especially with the moral majority in the 1980s, the rise of the evangelical right in the United States and in U.S. politics. That really saw this emergence of anti-abortion politics within political circles that it had not traditionally embraced. Well, that had not traditionally embraced it. So yeah, that's actually accurate. At least that aspect. I have read that much before. But as to the specific drivers like Jimmy Carter and racism and whatnot, I don't know about that. So I couldn't comment on that. But yeah, views of abortion have definitely changed a lot over time in the United States. No, that's not an overstatement at all. Let's see. And what was, oh, I have to go back to Neural Home, the House of Respect. Oh, Dagnip. Yeah, if you're listening, Dagnip, I actually did get the email. I'm just taking my time responding. You put a lot of effort, obviously, into writing up the email. There's a lot of research and whatnot. You clearly did. So I want to make sure that I reciprocate. I want to make sure that I put a lot of thought into my response too, so as I can kind of respect your effort. So I'll definitely get back to you, but it might take a little bit of time. I'm trying to look up some data from Transparency International and I guess Freedom House. There's some statistics there that I want to try to use. So I'll put that in there in my response. So it's basically a paper I'm going to write, a short paper, and it's like a lot of papers I've written, I tend to put them off for a little bit. So give me a week or two, and I'll be happy to get back to you.
That is fair. You get a big message, you want to give a thorough reply, it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
I know that one.
Yeah, but thank you. Thank you for taking the time. I do appreciate that. I enjoy learning about different countries, and a lot of people like to talk about their country, but they don't have a lot of time. They have commitments, so their ability to kind of spend time writing about it or talking to me about it is limited. So I always appreciate when people take the time to kind of share their thoughts and their histories about where they come from.
Well, cool. We had a bit of a spicy episode today. Chat was definitely spicy. I want to thank the moderators and other viewers who have been keeping cool heads through all of this. Thanks for trying your best with it.
Can we do one more thing?
Sure.
Do you have the link to Ukraine live map?
I can pull it up. liveuamap.com, that one?
Yes. So if you could, let me see, what's the easiest way to do this? Do you see the red line? There's like a little territory in the southeast of Ukraine that's surrounded by a red line.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, then just northwest of that, you can see there's a little bit of territory still controlled by Ukraine. That's not colored red. That's kind of jutting into all the red space. Do you see that?
So you're saying southeast, there's a red line around this spot here. I'm not sure if you have the stream up.
Yeah.
There's this region.
No, not the one in the south, the one in the southeast. Yeah.
And where?
So if you zoom, that's separatist controlled territory in the southeast. So if you look northwest of that, you should find a city called Severodonetsk.
Is it pretty close to the red or further?
Very. Yeah, it's very close. It's in the white space. You can see a salient pushing into the red area. It's like a little sort of horn of white pushing into the red. Do you see that? So if you look at the tip of the horn, you should find Severodonetsk.
Novrodonetsk, Severisk.
That's northeast. Yeah, the actual city is, the name of the city is sort of in the red, so it's a little hard to see. It's like right where the white meets the red.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's right in that area that you're in.
The name is in the red. Okay.
Yeah,
oh yeah,
it's to the
Severodonetsk.
east.
Yeah, I see it.
There
I
it
was
is.
looking
Yeah.
in the white for it, and I'm like, am I blind? No, it's right here. Okay.
Yeah. So that city just fell to the Russians, and they've been fighting with the Ukrainians for it for the past, what, a couple weeks, maybe a month or so. So that's been a big battle. And so you can kind of see that salient there, right? So there's Severodonetsk, and then just south of that, you've got, oh, I forget what it's called, but it's right there. So what you're
Lyshansk.
seeing here in this picture that you have right here that I'm looking at in your screen, that's where all of the fighting has been happening in Ukraine. There's been a little bit here and there. There's been some missile strikes in other areas, but all of the heavy fighting that you've heard about in the news has been happening right here around Severodonetsk and in that other area there, in that salient. So I wanted to point that out. And then I was going to ask you, keeping in mind that's where the fighting is, right? That area there specifically. So zoom out and look at the whole country.
Yeah, that's really far to the east.
It's really far to the east and it's really, really small. That is a very tiny area that they've been fighting over.
Yeah.
So, what I want to point out is that all of the heavy fighting that you've heard about, or at least the vast majority of it, is happening right there in that tiny area. And it's taken the Russians roughly a month or so to really take Severodonetsk and reduce that area. So consider just how much effort the Russians are having to put in just to fight for that tiny sliver of territory compared to the entire country of Ukraine and all the other areas of the front. So the point I'm making here is the war is not really going well for Russia. Yes, they're making progress in Donbass, but it's very, very slow. And both Russia and Ukraine are only really capable of fighting for very small areas at a given time. They have not really shown a capability to fight in a greater area or a greater capacity beyond these sorts of limited operations. So as ferocious as the fighting is, that's just one small part of the front, and it's not clear that they can really do more than that. So even if the Russians are slowly grinding forward and taking more territory and making progress, keep in mind that it's taken a lot of time just to make even that limited amount of progress, and that they would have to do way more than that. If they even wanted to liberate the rest of Donetsk, it's going to take several more weeks or months. And if they wanted to do the rest of Ukraine, even if they just wanted to push to the Dnieper, you're looking at years, given the current rate of gains they've been making territorially. So even if Ukraine hasn't really been doing as well now as they were doing in the first month or so, that doesn't mean they're losing the war. I just want to make that clear. Because I see some people on Reddit and whatnot kind of complaining, oh, this war is not winnable for Ukraine. The Russians are just going to steamroll them over the long term. Yeah, they have some advantages, but given how badly they're doing and given how limited their ability to prosecute the war is, like I hope I just illustrated, we can still have confidence in Ukraine. Like, the war is not over. There's still a lot of fight left. And there's going to be a 1-year gap or so that we talked about last time, where things are probably not going to go great for Ukraine, just because the pacing of supplies from the West is going to slow down just because of limitations in inventories and productive capacity. So there's going to be a stretch here where things aren't going to go great. But if we stick it out, we can definitely win out in the long term. It's still viable. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm not saying things can't go wrong. I'm not saying there's not a risk of escalation. But what I'm saying is, just because the Russians make some gains in a very small area doesn't mean the war is all but over and we should give up. That's not the takeaway.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these areas, they're very far from like the core hub of where Ukrainian activity is happening. Like, ever since Kyiv was defended, they basically can do all of their stuff in terms of maintaining a government and a nation and that sort of thing. And they're trying to hold their perimeter for as long as they can. And attacking is very costly, so it's one of those, can they just make it so exorbitantly expensive for the attackers that the fight is given up? So they end up taking a defensive victory.
Yeah.
We will see. I didn't actually know that the scale of where the fighting is that small. There were like another round of articles that all came out at a similar time of Russia is finally making gains in Ukraine. But for the average person, they're not going to know the extent of that. Like, was it a really big territorial gain, or was it a small territorial gain? People in the chat are saying that the next thing for the Russians is to try to get over a river that's not bridged. So they've got
Yeah,
a
well,
lot of
actually,
obstacles.
you can see that on the map because the city of Severodonetsk has a twin city just across the river, which is right adjacent to it. They're basically the same city, but there's a river between them. So the twin city is called Lysychansk. It's a very Slavic name. I have a
Lysychansk.
hard. There you go, Lysychansk.
Yeah, I can see the
So
river here at the edge of the red.
yeah, so that river is what the Russians are hung up on. That they've taken the city of Severodonetsk, but now they have to cross the river and take Lysychansk,
It looks like
and
there's
that's
a
going to
road
be.
here. Did they blow up the bridge or something?
They did. Yeah, they blew up all of the roads leading to Severodonetsk. They also blew up the only bridge that was linking Severodonetsk to Lysychansk, isolating the city. Yeah, they're probably not going to be able to take Lysychansk by crossing the river. They've been pretty bad at river crossings thus far in the war. You can see that river actually extends to the northwest, and you can see that the front line actually adheres very closely to that river. And that's not by accident. Like almost every attempt the Russians have made to cross that river has been successfully defeated by the Ukrainian army. So what the Russians have been doing instead is that they've actually been pushing up from the south. You can kind of see some of the dots there on the map indicating action. So the Russian army south of Lysychansk is kind of trying to push up northwest of the city to cut off the Ukrainian army there. So there have been some reports that the Ukrainian army is going to withdraw from the city, and so that they don't get cut off. So that could happen. You know, like they may lose Lysychansk for that reason, but what's not going to happen, it seems, is that the Russian army is going to push across the river and seize the city. That seems pretty unlikely, given their poor river crossing capability.
Once again, a logistical challenge.
Yeah, yeah. It's they've suffered a lot of losses trying to making the effort. A lot of them have seen. I've seen the photographs and the video and whatnot. But yeah, just keep in mind that yes, Russia is making gains, but it's not like sweeping offensives, you know, moving through the Ukrainian countryside. They're still making just very small incremental gains over time. And most of the fighting that they've done, you know, pretty much all of the energy they've expended, as ferocious as it's been, has just been focused in that one tiny area. And that's just because that's about all they can do. That's all they can handle. If they distributed their forces more, they wouldn't have enough strength to push through. So they have to focus on just small areas like that in order to try to press their advantage in artillery as much as they can. But if they fight the rest of the war like that, then it's just going to take forever for them to actually fight Ukraine to defeat. Like Ukraine definitely still has a big defender's advantage here. So just I would just ask that people not lose sight of that as we go forward. You know, don't be put off of supporting Ukraine just because there's a few setbacks here and again, or maybe even persistent setbacks. You know, again, it's probably going to be a rough year or so, but they can stick it out so long as that we continue to support them.
Well, I know Bitter Sugar and his family are still all right. I did get an update from him a few weeks back. One of the tough things is his some of his family had to evacuate the eastern part of the country, and they found out that the area is probably Russian controlled, so their house is probably being used, which is kind of gross. It's just one of those gross feelings of if you have to evacuate somewhere and the hostile forces have taken over your property, it feels violating for sure. So
Yeah.
we're sending courage their way. But it's definitely a really massively difficult time for the Ukrainian people. Hang in there, fam.
Best of luck to them. But I just wanted to make that point real quick before we pack up here.
Well, sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Agent Smith, for going long today. We did have quite the topic to tackle, and you handled it with grace and professionalism, which I appreciate. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey and Moss Neotech, for helping handle questions. And thank you, chat, for not completely catching on fire.
Oh man, are you going to post this right away? I'm eager to dip into chat, see what was happening.
Yes, I will publish the VOD right away so you can peruse it and be
Thank you.
aghast and amused at the same time.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.
someone in the chat wanted me to remind you for the 20-minute walk, so you can't blame me for that one. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thank you again, sir. Always a privilege. I'll see you next time.
GG. Nice.